and Representative John Michael Parker.
No, ma'am.
Thank you, sir. And with that, we would like to immediately proceed to our list of speakers today. And first being our commissioner, we're very grateful to have her in our company. And so that's Commissioner Katie Dykes, please.
Well, good morning, members of the two committees. I'm so grateful to be with you this morning. My name is Katie Dykes. I'm the commissioner at the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. And this is bringing back fond memories from the last joint session of the Environment and Commerce Committees in 2021, where we had the opportunity to talk about all of the benefits that we could achieve for the environment and for the economy should the state take the step of moving to sunset the Transfer Act and shift to a release-based framework to regulate the cleanups of contamination. And lo, these many years, we have been working on just that. I just want to appreciate the hard work that we of so many stakeholders who've been at the table with DEEP since the bill passed that authorized us to start working on release-based cleanup program. We know that Connecticut is one of only 2 states in the nation that rely upon a real estate or business transaction to be the trigger for the cleanup of releases. Connecticut was a leader in the early 1980s when we first put this program in place to address an issue that the market was not addressing at the time, effectively ensuring that there would be investigation and cleanup of contamination to protect public health. But since that time, when we became the first mover, other states have embraced a different approach and a better approach for regulating cleanups that harnesses the incentives and the activities that the market and that investors are already making to ensure that environmental liability is being addressed. And so we feel that this is, we are long overdue to eliminate the Transfer Act system and relieve businesses and residents of the economic burdens of that program. I know that you'll hear from our sister agency from DECD about the tremendous economic development benefits that await when we make this change. But it is truly one of those rare opportunities where, or not rare, but a critical opportunity where we can make progress both in improving environmental outcomes and improving our economic development opportunities here in the state. And that's why I'm so thrilled to have been working first with Commissioner Lehman and now with Commissioner O'Keefe and his team on this important effort. From an environmental perspective, we know that there are almost 5,000 properties that have come into the Transfer Act. Less than 500 have completed their cleanups since this law first came into place in 1985. So the numbers really speak to themselves that the current regime that we have is not effective and is basically trapping these properties, many of which are in city centers. Apologize. And are next to critical transportation infrastructure. They're great transit-oriented development sites. They're adjacent to communities that would truly tremendously benefit from having new economic development, new employers moving in. They'll contribute to increasing the grand lists in our city centers. There's so much development that is being held back from the Transfer Act, and these efforts that we're undertaking will help unleash faster cleanups, more redevelopment of former industrial properties, and fewer abandoned properties. But of course, we have to not just, as eager as we are to get rid of the Transfer Act and shift to this new framework, it's critically important that we replace it with a new framework that is going to, that we get this right. And so for that reason, we have been engaged in an unprecedented level of stakeholder dialogue over the last several years on the development of the release-based cleanup regulations. This was principally achieved through a working group that was co-convened by DEEP and DCD. And I want to credit you, Senator Hartley, for being the architect of that working group structure, which was something brand new to us, but I think has yielded tremendous results. Our working group monthly meetings started in December of 2020. We hosted, all told, over 60 working group meetings to date. The working groups included 10 different subcommittees formed by the working group to draft concept papers that then formed the foundation for regulations drafted by DEEP. All told, we've held over 150 days of public comment on periods as we sought public comment in 2024 on two successive drafts of the regulations. We held 12 different stakeholder sessions in 2024 on the regulations. We first provided the draft regulations to the working group in December of 2023, and then they had a 60-day comment period on the draft regs. DEEP took those comments, incorporated them into changes into the draft regulation, which we then issued for public comment in July of 2024. We provided a 3-month comment period, which is longer than our typical, that appropriate to the complexity of these regulations. And then I just want to, and then we received lots of comments and we worked, I just want to say that the team you'll be hearing from today deserves enormous credit, particularly Graham Stevens and Brennan Shane, and Emma Simino, our deputy commissioner, who worked through the holidays to incorporate all that input because we very much want to get this regulation. We wanted to have the regulation submitted to the Regs Review Committee in time for the committee to have ample opportunities through the spring to consider it, while in parallel being able to work with both Environment and Commerce committees on some accompanying statutory modifications that we think have resulted from the discussions with the working group, where we've identified a few instances where some statutory changes would be helpful to provide for a seamless transition to a release-based framework. Principal among those changes would be extending the time period for when the Transfer Act would sunset and the release-based framework would come into effect to be March 1st of next year. It's really important. We know that already there's a lot of parties that are anticipating this new framework and maybe waiting to transact deals until the release-based framework is in place. So we don't want to delay the implementation too long, but at the same time, we also wanted to ensure that there's time to work through some of the implementation details of the release-based framework. And so that's where we achieved that arrived at that March 1 timeframe. So the last thing I'll say, and then I hope we'll have the opportunity to hear answer any questions that you may have, is that, over these 5 years, as we've worked so hard with these working group members, I think we have really laid a strong foundation for this new regulatory framework. We have, I think that this is a big change. We have endeavored as much as possible to borrow from neighboring states, particularly Massachusetts, where many of the sector that helps to implement these cleanups also works in Massachusetts. So we've been able to borrow from best practice in our neighboring states, but we also have the important statutory foundations, some of the particular features of our Connecticut laws and precedent and circumstances that we needed to harmonize with as well. And we're trying to provide for as much certainty and clarity as possible to make this transition seamless. So I think that has helped us to address many issues through through the working group process. But there are also, of course, I fully expect that as we go forward and have this framework in place, that we are, we're in a spirit of continuous improvement. We want to continue to stay engaged with this working group so that we can get active and real-time feedback on how the implementation is going, be able to have direct dialogue on the development of guidance documents and forms and other critical tools that will help with compliance with the new regulation. So we very much look forward to staying engaged with this working group and the statutory changes that you have in front of us, embrace that, and then be able to provide any recommendations back to the legislature or pursue regulatory tweaks as we go forward, so that we can take active learnings from how things are going and make this program even stronger. So in my mind, I think we're not surprised to hear that there are continue to be questions and suggestions that are coming from our working group members, and we embrace that, and we think that that's a sign that there continues to be more for us to discuss, more for us to work on, more for us to engage with our working group members on as after the regs are approved and as we prepare for implementation. And we would certainly, we all very much appreciate how engaged the leadership of both committees have been throughout this working group process. And we feel that this is going to be a collaborative effort going forward between the executive branch and the legislature and our stakeholders. And so lastly, I just want to say an enormous thank you to all of the working group members. It's a tremendous public service that they provided in lending all of their pro bono, volunteer hours to give us input, give us feedback. Here at the department, we could not have crafted these regulations without their hard work and willingness to volunteer and invest in this transformative effort. And so with that, I will close my opening comments and look forward to hearing any questions that the committees may have for us today.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Commissioner. First of all, can I ask, are your comments being submitted to us so that there are members in, all over this building and
Oh, sure. Yes, I believe we have that, the written testimony, if it's not filed yet, will be coming. It is filed. And I think it's probably even a better frame than my opening comments, but in any case.
okay, thanks. Just to make sure that we're, keeping everybody else up to date. So Madam Commissioner and Deep Team and DECD Deputy, and tell Dan I'm missing him. Take a bow because this has been a very unusual and long process. Quite frankly, it's gone on for 2+ decades. And I don't think anybody has gotten as far as this group has gotten. So that's obviously a landmark accomplishment. That's just a testimony to, you used the word complex, to the, it's a tangled web, and it's got long tentacles and, many opportunities for unintended consequences. And we've lived with it for this time. And we've learned from it. And I think that we're now in this position to take the best of all of that time. And quite frankly, the other models that you referred to, Commissioner, to make the very best system, recognizing that, we have limitations ourselves in terms of, how we underwrite and staff and the rest of this. For clarification for those who might be watching and who are with us right now, we have 3 bills in front of us. And I would indicate that items 1 and items 3 are duplicative. Just so people recognize that. And then the second item, it talks about our follow-on, which is very important. And so I'm sure there are many questions here, but let me just quickly, because you did talk about after the regs are approved, and that's coming up on March 25th, March 25th. So a couple of weeks, we're going to have these regs before us. And so what is before us today are the statutory changes that plug into the effectiveness of those regs. And I will just say on the record, because I have said it to all of you, many of you, that I have great trepidation about adopting or passing legislation when the regulations upon which those statutory changes are being made have not yet been passed by the General Assembly. So there's a lot of assumptions here before us. And I understand that. And we're hoping, obviously, that this all flows, but we have to recognize reality because we've come so far. And we didn't work this hard. And by the way, Commissioner, you talked about your team, DECD's team, and all of the regulated community who put hours. And, I always say, with them, the meter's always running because it is. And so there have been hour upon hour, and quite frankly, year upon year, that they have invested in this. And then they've come back a number of times because, as I'm told, I've been around a long time, but not that long. And, they talked about 2 other times we got closer and then, it didn't happen. So we didn't come this far to not get it right. And so with that, I ask you, there were white papers that have been summarized, so up to date with some of the primary individuals in our working group, and they are, of course, the bankers, the realtors, and the environmental professionals. And I'm understanding there's one white paper with 11 points. There is another white paper with about 6 or so. My question is, are you continuing to work on those outstanding items?
Yes, the answer is yes. So thank you, Senator. I'll say we've had great, dialogue and communication with our with the working group stakeholders throughout, and I know DECD has as well. So we, appreciated seeing these lists of additional suggestions that came forward from the Connecticut Realtors Association and Bankers Association, as well as EPOC. We're taking all of the, we've spent some time with these lists since we received them last week, and taking seriously all of the questions and the suggestions that are made therein. I think many of these items in here are things that we look forward to. These are the kinds of things that I anticipated we would be able to continue to work with our stakeholders on through the working group that is contemplated continuing in the legislation that you have in front of you today. Some of these, and so we hope that expectation is also shared by our stakeholders. But we are continuing to have, as I mentioned to you earlier, active round the clock conversations with the stakeholders to figure out, where we can come together and how we can continue, just as we have in getting to the draft regulations, how we can continue to take this input and find solutions that are workable to, both protect human health and provide for a clear and seamless and uneventful transition, if you will, to the release-based framework. But we are absolutely, ramping up a lot of those conversations with stakeholders, given the criticality of the actions, that are and the decisions that are before the legislature this session in terms of the Regs Review Committee and these two committees on the statute, on the legislation that you have in front of you.
Thank you, Commissioner. So if I hear you, you continue to work, that summary, those white papers may at first blush seem like a lot of items, but quite frankly, truth be known, they pale in comparison to what's been accomplished thus far and what is represented before us. So I view those as minuscule compared to where we've been. However, no less important, and some of them, quite frankly, are larger conversations. So you are right now in the present tense continuing to work with those groups on those particular issues.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Mhm.
So then can we expect to have, and I know we are in crunch time and, the clock is ticking more rapidly than it ever has. Can we expect to get from you update on where you are on those items as you continue to maybe come to terms with some of them? As I said to Commissioner previously, to tick them off the list, to narrow that list down. Can we, as a body, expect to have an update on that, and how soon?
Well, it's critically important. I know it's, for example, as you sit on both the Regs Review Committee, Senator, as well as chairing Commerce, that, legislators like yourself who are going to need to cast key votes, will want to be as informed. We want you to be as informed as possible about what are in these lists and where the department feels we can work to address these in real time. So we will we have crafted some response or some reactions to these proposals from stakeholders, and we'll be glad to share that back with the committee members. And again, we're continuing to stay. Our intention is to stay in active discussion with our stakeholders on any ways to address these in the near term or through the future process with the working group.
Thank you.
And I would also say that in some cases, the ability to address some of these. So, for example, one stakeholder group, pointed to a need for more supporting documents and forms, and we know how important, how valuable and effective it's been when we are developing guidance documents, and when we can do that collaboratively and share them with our stakeholders ahead of time. That can often be a tool to provide the kind of clarity that those who are going to have to implement and advise clients about the new obligations, we know that could be really a valuable tool. So having, we want to work towards providing all of those kinds of documents and forms. That's what we'll be doing if and when the regulations are approved. And so in some ways, it's achieving this critical milestone to provide the reassurance or the confidence, hopefully secure the confidence of the Regs Review Committee that these issues are being addressed and can be addressed in the future, will hopefully enable us to get to a place where we have clarity that the regs are being adopted, so that then we can develop these implementing tools around them. But we this is crunch time, and we recognize that we're treating this time, there's no bigger priority, I think, for the department, for this team in the legislative session at this point. Don't tell my other committees, but that's the truth.
One of which is here with us.
Energy is not here, I think.
Oh,
So,
okay.
so just keep it quiet between us.
Okay, so then I guess what I'm asking you is, are we going to, within a week, hear about some solutions relative to those white papers?
I think that's definitely, yes, that's a timeline we can meet and welcome the opportunity to be in dialogue with the legislative leaders on this as we're talking with those stakeholders in real time.
And, we have our own legislative deadlines, as you know, for purposes of committees, but we have, obviously, as we're all very aware of, is the regulations review, and we're going to have to make a determination on that soon. So without having the benefit of the up-to-date responses, that becomes near impossible.
Yeah, I would just say, oh, sorry. Emma Semino, Deputy Commissioner of the Environmental Quality Branch at DEEP. Thank you all for being here today. We're excited to be here. I would say-
Really?
yes, this is a milestone, Senator. I think that, we're certainly going to continue working through these white papers. At this point, we do not anticipate any of those items changing, needing any statutory changes or impacting any of the legislation you have before you. But certainly, if that changes, we would alert you to that, in addition to the kind of regular updates that we're planning to provide.
Thank you, Emma. And so, Senator Lopes, Representative Meskers.
Commissioner, thank you for coming to testify before us. So I think my principal issue is going to be addressed in the second item, which is the review process. I don't know if I made this explicit and I'm not throwing a monkey wrench. Are you anticipating either having a public site or coming back to us on what I will colloquially say, when we get the system up and running, check-in time and check-out time? Because what I'm looking to get, I've had issues with another agency that will remain nameless who told me everybody was happy with everything they were doing. And I think they're happier now after a conversation. But I think the issues when we want to get to a process on the next piece of the, in terms of a review process, which we'll talk about later, maybe in terms of as we're building out documents, and I assume there's going to be some lag and some friction. But as we build out and complete the documents, I really am looking at what's the check-in time, what's the checkout time for the solution for remediation, so that the people are getting concise answers, they're filling out their forms, they're getting it done. I'm not sure what your expectations are now, and I'm not sure what in practice happens in the other states, but I'm not sure if the turnaround time is 6 months, if the completion time is 18 months, that kind of stuff is, how does someone engage in, I've got toxins, I want to fix it, and I want to release. So are you anticipating what's been standard away from us, and what timeline are we trying to work to? I know that's apart from the toxin, and it's not I'm dismissing that. I do want that solved, but I want to get the idea of the time frame.
Yeah, I think is your question around how long it will take for properties to move through the cleanup program?
They register, identify, and they're then trying to remediate. Yeah, kind of the timeline.
Yeah. I mean, I think we can certainly try to mock up a few examples for you. So much of it depends on the detail of the pollution, how extensive it is, how widespread it is on a parcel, what the pollution is. But I think certainly we hope that we will move more properties through this new program than we have since 1985. But we're happy to kind of, if it would be helpful, create a couple examples of how we're anticipating this going.
No, I'm thinking more, I don't know if it's anticipated within the bill. I'm hoping that we'll have that dialogue about people are checking in and checking out with certain timeframes. And they're comparable to the other states in terms of, we're going to define our solution, but that we've got a comparable time frame, that we enter into an agreement, we get it solved.
Representative, hi. Joint committees, this is fun. My name is Graham Stevens. I'm the Chief of Water Protection and Land Reuse. And I'm happy to testify between two joint committee meetings. This is a monumental occasion for me. So I just wanted to speak, Representative, to your question about, timeframes. So one of the things that we worked really hard at in the regulations was to try to create predictability in our expectations on timeframes, and also to right-size those timeframes through discussions with the stakeholders about what is achievable. It's hard for me to sometimes reframe my thinking where we're talking about, cleaning up properties to now cleaning up releases. So we hope that these actions will be much more prompt and much less administratively burdensome for both the regulated community and for DEEP. And one thing that we've done in the past when it comes to DEEP's actions that we heard from the stakeholder groups in the past is try to track our progress and success. So through the commissioners' undertaking, we launched the 20 by 20 initiative, which I'm sure you've heard about. And now it's rebranded 20 by 26, and these are 20 process improvement actions that we take to increase our predictability, transparency, and accountability. That includes a lot of public display of metrics. And in the Transfer Act, there was a past problem with respect to DEEP's timeframes with auditing, as Senator Hartley remembers very well. Where the department then worked to set up a process where we set a goal of 90 days to close out these audits for entire properties, not just for one release. And we've been tracking that since 2020 to ensure that over 90% of our actions are completed within 90 days, and we're hitting that in some quarters 100%, some quarters 95% of the time. We post that on our webpage. We share that with our stakeholder groups, and then we talk about what are the situations where the audits that didn't meet those timeframes, what are the issues, right? Then we could talk about how do we address those issues, whether it's through additional explanation by those who submit information to us, or whether it's us marshaling our resources to that important function. So just like we've done in the past with the Transfer Act, it's going to be really critical on the auditing side of our program, which is the state going to even look at it? And if we do look at it, how quickly are we going to make that decision? People really need certainty on timing and cost. Cost can be scoped out by our licensed environmental professionals who are expert in the field based on the regulations we've drafted. But DEEP's action is within our realm, and we're going to be ensuring that our auditing functions are sized not only to time, but also to risk, something we've never done before. So we're going to be spending more time looking at the riskier things and less time looking at the less risky things.
Perfect. I really appreciate that answer. My concern is that if you remember 2 years ago, we increased remediation funds from, I think, 50 million to 70 million for the state to clean up brownfields. My concern is that we get the brownfields cleaned, and as you highlighted for transit-oriented development, for our distressed municipalities, we want properties back on the tax rolls once the risks are mitigated, and we want to make sure that we can attract developers and give them a time frame as to how they get into the system, out of the system. So I appreciate that. I don't think I have a follow-up question. I just wanted to, I think in intent, I appreciate. So I'm fine with that answer. I just want to make sure you understood my intent was to make sure that I will be looking at and asking going forward. And I think you've made your intent clear. So I really appreciate it. No further question, Madam Chair.
For the committee, the committees, apologies. So DECD and DEEP recently hosted a developers forum, which you may hear about more. And we, DECD invited developers, Spinnaker, that does a lot of work on residential, and Win Stanley Group that does a lot in biomedical, warehousing, and industrial space. And they took sites that had previously been in the Transfer Act and looked at them from the lens of the new release-based regulations and analyzed time savings and cost savings associated with this change. So we've been trying to test drive some of these regulations already. And I think people have seen that some of the hangups and hiccups of the current system are actually being eliminated with this change.
Perfect. And I guess that's the most important thing, is the word of mouth will be very important, because if we've had problems in the past, once bitten, twice shy, and it's important that we get the news out. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Meskers, and Representative John Michael Parker.
Thank you, Madam
To
Chair.
be followed by Senator Cohen.
Oh, great. Thank you, ma'am. Thanks for hosting us today, Commerce Friends. And thanks all for being here. I'm speaking with a lot of humility coming into the end of a ongoing decade-long process, and appreciation for the work that y'all have done for this. And with that, you folks are having a balance, and we appreciate you doing it, both the commerce and the environment angles here on this important work. And so I'm just asking to see if there's anything else you wanted to share as someone that's, again, a little bit newer to it. As we come through the final stretch here, are there any concerns you have about some of the environmental impacts of the ongoing conversations, or the things we have to tweak, and, so that our committee, a couple of them here, and myself and Senator Lopes can support with that in this final stretch? Because we know you're sort of balancing those two sides, and I just wanted to do my due diligence to lift that up. So are there any environmental issues that are still on the radar we need to kind of keep an eye on?
Well, I do want to say that I think what we're proposing here in terms of the transition to the release-based framework is something that's going to significantly benefit the environment. I think that we've learned a lot about cleanups in Connecticut over the last, 50 plus years. I mean, we have a proud history, stretching back to the Industrial Revolution of a lot of precision manufacturing and economic activity over spanning centuries. And some of our city centers in particular are bearing the burden of that legacy that's compounded by a framework that was well-intentioned, but has not worked well to harness and incent market forces to derive cleanups and return these sites to productive reuse. And so in that sense, we've been kind of, held back, I think, where neighboring states have not been in being able to provide for marketable sites for new investment. And this it's bad for the economy, but it's really bad for people who live adjacent to these sites with unaddressed contamination. As we get, we've gotten used to just seeing that chain link fence that's thrown up around a property and just assume that that's the way it has to be. And it's almost as if we stop even noticing those abandoned factories, but and locations. But this is going to be a big open for business and a big improvement to public health when we have a framework that now finally works with the market to drive investment. One of the things that I'm excited about as part of this transition is that we'll reduce the cost of cleanups. We right now with the Transfer Act, we put that regulatory burden to clean up, have these micromanaged cleanups in the Transfer Act only on certain properties, and this program rebalance that to be not just the usual suspects that will have these obligations. So that's good in terms of from an equity and from an environmental standpoint. But at the same time, we will be relieving those establishments, as the usual suspects are called in the Transfer Act, from having to go out and do overly extensive investigations, to go out and spend a ton of money to investigate every inch of their property and prove that there's no contamination present. So that makes these cleanups much more expensive than they need to be. And so in that sense, we're rebalancing around a risk-based approach, which we think is going to protect human health, but also recognize that we can achieve the environmental outcomes and the public health protections that we need with a better cleanup requirements that are better calibrated to what the future activity on that site will be. With that said, I think one of the things that we continue to hear about, and that I know is the top of the list of the issues that we are going to stay in dialogue with stakeholders over these next critical days and weeks of this session, is about the treatment of residential properties. And we've engaged that topic throughout the working group process. And it's one that we want to continue to be, hearing from stakeholders about how to provide the type of certainty that they need to ensure that these new obligations are workable within our current frameworks in the residential sector. I will highlight that, of course, like the inclusion of residential properties is important because that's where kids and families live, and that's where people spend a lot of time and have increased risk of exposure. So we've got to get that piece right. We made some, significant changes in the final regulation to provide some exemptions for historical releases for single-family properties that are owner occupied. We know that this is an issue that where there's continued discussion, and just want to highlight that's something that we want to, we're going to continue to be in dialogue with folks, because it is important to have the benefit of a framework that is protecting, kids and families and public health in residential properties. But we need to do it in a way that our stakeholders, feel comfortable with. And so those are the conversations that we're looking forward to continuing to have over the next days and weeks.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. And most importantly, what I hear is the continued dialogue on that. It seems quite important from my perspective that we're able to, um, and as you mentioned, Commissioner, connecting this to public health and to safety for people, not just the environment, or people that live in the environment. And so as that is an area where there still needs to be some work on it, just appreciate the ability to keep doing that and know that my colleagues will continue to push that forward. So thanks for mentioning that. That's all from me, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Senator Cohen is remote. Good morning, Senator.
Good morning, Madam Chair. Thank you so much. And thank you, Commissioner, for your testimony. I remember coming into the legislature in 2019 and getting a crash course on the Transfer Act. What was not working with the Transfer Act at the time, it certainly wasn't working for the state of Connecticut. And we heard over and over again from businesses that were sort of stuck in this loop. So I just want to, number one, thank Senator Hartley for all of her work on this and in moving this forward. She was a great partner in this when I was chairing the environment and actually vice chair of the Commerce Committee at the time. So we had that continuum going between the committees, between the agencies, and working really well together. Really trying to strike that important balance between protecting our environment, but allowing for vital economic development in the state. And we were able to look to our neighbors to the north and what they were doing. I know as a model what was working well for them and what wasn't working well. And as a member of the working group for about a year and a half, I saw firsthand how difficult it was to come to consensus. And so I also want to just give a shout out to Bureau Chief Graham Stevens, because what I saw in terms of his mediating skills was really quite impressive. It was a big group. And as you said, Commissioner, lots of people giving a lot of time to this effort, time and energy, unpaid, of course, all volunteer work. So grateful for all of that. These large working groups, obviously, with somewhat opposing views, you could say, although, we certainly all want economic development and we all want to protect our environment. But as I said, striking that balance can be very difficult. And so, a lot of compromise is required. And I just wonder if there's anything in particular that is outstanding on these white papers that Senator Hartley mentioned that should be highlighted, that are of particular concern, that we haven't been able to reach consensus on, and that both the Commerce and Environment Committees should be made aware of as you continue to navigate this process. And by the way, I'm glad to hear of your willingness to continue communications with all of the key stakeholders moving forward, that the work just doesn't end once the regulations are passed. So with that, just wondered if you wanted to comment on any of the potentially outstanding items of concern particular to the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection.
Senator Graham Stevens here. It's good to see your office again. I was a mainstay in the working group for the early years. Thank you for your leadership. So the department has recently met with our stakeholder organizations that have submitted these white papers, and we've started the discussion. That does not mean the discussion is over. We're in the process of setting up a subsequent meeting with the bankers and the realtors to discuss their concerns. And our conversations with the EPOC are ongoing as well. We too, I think both sides need to understand each other's perspective, because the regulation, as much as we have attempted to streamline and make it as concise as possible, it's a long regulation, and there's many different factors that go into each individual policy discussion. So there are issues around the applicability and the breadth and scope of exemptions as it relates to residential property that we've talked about here today. There's also while, many of our stakeholders were very pleased to see and asked for, a lower bounds provisions that below which, you are not, implicated in this regulation. I think that there needs to be some more conversation about, what's in and what's out of those lower bounds. And that's something that we certainly want to sit down with the stakeholders and understand their perspective and think about some case studies and issues around those factors. So, that this conversation is ongoing. I know the deputy commissioner is working today to set up those follow-up meetings with these stakeholders. And these are issues, some of which we've been dealing with for many years, right? Some of these are about audit reopeners, which is really what we did is we took the language from the Transfer Act and put it into regulation because the Transfer Act is going away. So we need to understand, is there a change with respect to that longstanding provision as it relates to the new regs? So I think that conversation and that exchange of information, which we've been engaged in for 5 years now, needs to occur. It just needs to occur, as the senator said, much more rapidly than some past discussions have taken to resolve.
I appreciate that. And could I just ask, is that when you talk about these spills, what maybe need where we need to find some consensus in the spill itself, the amount, is this primarily with respect to residential properties that's outstanding, or both commercial and residential?
Good morning, Senator. My name is Brendan Shane. I'm the legal director for the Department's Environmental Quality Branch. So two things to point out. One, in response to your concern, there's a residential bucket of questions, and there's a bucket about these lower bounds provisions that apply to all releases, where there are some questions. And just to add to what Graham said, many of these areas are areas where the department has already made significant compromise. And so if you went and looked at the draft version of the regs that was released at the end of last calendar year, and then looked at the version that came out in July, and now look at the current version, there's been significant move towards compromise on many issues. I think some of the questions now are about, whether the right balance has been achieved. And many of those questions would benefit from, data as the program gets started about the types of releases that are coming into the system and whether we're capturing the right things. And so I think understanding how, in response to stakeholder feedback, the department kind of reached the compromises it's already proposed, and understanding how we'll measure the success of those compromises and its impact on the system is really important, and something we look forward to doing, over the look back period that's proposed by one of the bills before you today.
Thank you. And I don't doubt that there's already been a tremendous amount of compromise. I saw it myself in the early year of in the early time of that working group. But I would just say that, as I've contended from the beginning, we certainly want economic development, and we don't want people sort of stuck in this spill process as they had been with the Transfer Act, but we also need to be mindful of our environment, and any spill should be addressed in my mind. I think what we need to look at is really, the hold of the property, the cleanup required, or the remediation required, and maybe the penalty associated with that. But certainly we want to be able to address spills with respect to our environment. So appreciate you trying to strike this balance. I know it's very difficult. And again, thank you, Madam Chair, for all of your work on this.
And thank you, Senator Cohen, and also to your leadership, past and present, as we continue to go forward, as the work is not done, and we look for a perfect ending. But Senator Martin, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Personally, I just want to thank Commissioner Dykes, Commissioner Lehman, as well as Commissioner O'Keefe, all the stakeholders, the LEPs, the environmental attorneys, each of the teams. When I say the commissioners for each of the agencies, I also want to include your staff as well. The bankers, the realtors who brought this to our attention, I think 4 or 5 years ago. Graham, you were an outstanding moderator, as uh, Senator Cohen mentioned, your organizational skills and your time management was outstanding. It was no fooling around when we got to business, and there's a start time, there's a finish time, and I just can't say enough about what you brought to this, what your skill sets brought to this group of all of these stakeholders in one room or in various meetings. 150, 60 meetings, I think, right? And then plus all the subcommittee meetings. I don't have a whole lot of questions. I think what I heard, what there was going to be a review process after these regs are in place, that in a year from now, we'd come back and sort of say, oh yeah, what's working, not working. I like the fact, Graham, that there was a test drive, you're using your words here, with some developers. I know that there, you mentioned, Commissioner, there's 5,000 sites that are in the Transfer Act, and only 500 are sort of cleaned up or out of the Transfer Act now. Once these regulations get into play, we've been in the Transfer Act for 40 years. So now we've got 4,500 still in the Transfer Act. I'm not going to hold you to this, but how many are going to be out in 10 years from now?
It's a great question. And first, I want to also note, Senator, I know that you personally were at many of those working group meetings yourself. So I want to reflect that appreciation back to you that you've shared, generously on our team here. I couldn't be prouder of the work that we've been able to do together, and the engagement, the legislative engagement across both committees has been outstanding to signal how important this is to everyone to stay at the table and keep working. Even though it's been a multi-year process. Your question about what happens to those properties that remain in the Transfer Act is a really important one. And I've heard from some stakeholders about this just in the last few days. When the bill was originally passed to authorize 20-9 to authorize this work on the release-based regulations, there was a recognition at the time that many of these Transfer Act sites have transacted, right, liability and done their around the existence of the Transfer Act. So in some ways, we want to not disturb some of those settled agreements that may be in place around those sites. But at the same time, there's questions coming about, will the department, how will we work with those properties to provide them a bridge out of the Transfer Act that they can opt into if they prefer that pathway. We've been obviously, the bandwidth has been pretty maxed out, and among our team, just in terms of getting the release-based regulations delivered to the Regs Review Committee this spring. But we look forward to taking up that, working with the working group on that issue as one of the many that we hope to engage post, hopefully, reg adoption to help strengthen those pathways, to give those Transfer Act sites as many options as possible to either keep going under the legacy framework, or to opt into to find a new pathway out that takes the benefit of the release-based. And there are changes to the RSRs as well that are included in this reg package that will also benefit those legacy Transfer Act sites. So I appreciate you asking the question, because it's something we're absolutely committed to working on. We just needed to triage a bit to treat that as sort of the next project, given some of the bandwidth constraints of getting this really significant reg to the committee.
Just to add to the commissioner's comments about the cleanup standards changes, there are significant changes proposed to the state's cleanup standards that will make cleanups faster and more efficient and provide for a lighter administrative touch, including changes about historical fill is dealt with, including changes about the administrative process for dealing with rendering soil inaccessible. And these are big and meaningful changes, and will apply to Transfer Act sites on the effective date of the regulation going forward. So we believe a number of kind of legacy Transfer Act sites will be able to achieve these new cleanup standards quickly and move out of the Transfer Act without any need for additional regulations or statutory changes. And then in the time after the effective date of the regulations, we can continue to work on, as the commissioner said, additional bridges out of the Trans-Rect.
And one of those, again, Graham Stevens here, I'll try to speak into the mic properly. So one of those significant changes is in today's cleanup standards, there's a standard for residential cleanups and there's a standard for industrial commercial cleanups. We've seen through our experience that a lot of these past industrial sites are now trying to be repurposed for multifamily. And that's a really critical that's critical for DEEP, right? Because we want to see these sites, as the commissioner mentioned earlier, repositioned. They're right there where water is available, where sewer capacity is available, next to transit with energy and transportation infrastructure. These are well suited for residential repurposing. And so what we've looked at is the risks, again, trying to make this a risk-based program too. The risks associated with living in an apartment building are a lot different than living in a single family home. I've said this time and time again. People love to hear my jokes. Thank you to Senator that I'm punctual and organized. Sometimes I do make some jokes, but if you think about someone who lives in an apartment building, they're not spending a lot of time digging in their soil, not spending a lot of time going to Home Depot or Lowe's and buying shovels. That brings added risk. So when you're renting a property, you don't have that same full unfettered access to the subsurface. So we've come up with a brand new cleanup standard that's not residential, that's not industrial commercial, but is multifamily. And so there's an approach that's going to be different and it is associated with the risks than living in an apartment building or renting a property as opposed to, owning that property. And we hope that that will help to expedite these stuck transfer act sites and repurpose them to try to address some of the housing challenges that the state is currently experiencing.
Thank you. But three out of the four answered. Do I get the fourth one? No? All right. Regarding the white papers, I'll go to that. I know there's been ongoing discussions with some of the issues that are on there. If there are any changes between now and March 25th, are those going to be submitted into those regs?
So first, March 25th is our first meeting at the Regs Review Committee. I think it's a reasonable expectation that the regs will be rejected without prejudice, which is common the first time through, and that the LCO will make a number of suggestions about how to adjust the regulation, and that some of those suggestions are likely to be about additional clarity in the areas where some of these questions are raised, and that gives us the opportunity to respond substantively in a future submission. There is also, and so that's probably the primary mode through which issues may be addressed. I also think that, again, many of these issues are really amenable to future discussion and the data-driven look back and to kind of working towards a shared understanding, and may not require, actual changes to the text of the regulation.
Yeah, and I also think I just want to point out that we are somewhat limited in what we can adjust through the regs without having to go back through the Attorney General's office and the public comment period. But I think certainly as we continue these discussions, and if there are opportunities, as Brendan said, there's a pathway for some of the more minor changes that have been requested should LCO note them as well.
So
And now you're going to get 3 out of 4. Sorry.
all right, go
But
ahead.
I do want to be clear. I hopefully what's coming across to everyone who's been involved in this process with us all along is the department is taking pains right here to really signal that we're listening, being open to hear what the concerns are in these lists that we received, the white papers that we received from our stakeholder members, to the extent that we can constructively come up with solutions that address some of the concerns, we will. I think many of these items that have been raised here are some that only with practice of implementing or working on the implementation of the reg will we really gain the information needed to figure out if we're achieving the right balance. For example, suggestions around specific auditing goals for permitted environmental professionals, for example, is something that you know, this is, I feel like a forward looking, this is a placeholder for like, we need to stay in touch on this and figure out what the right percentage is going to be. It's not necessarily something that needs to get tweaked or baked into a regulation, if you will. But I think, I appreciate the invitation from Senator Hartley to provide the department's feedback on this list in short stead ahead of when the Regs Review Committee will be meeting, because we want to show where, you know, as we dig into the details of these, where the department views the possibility of solutions, or where we think, particularly for many of these, there are issues to be addressed as we go forward with the working group after hopefully a reg adoption and this statute has been approved. I also want to be clear that there are some, just, you know, one or two comments in here that are speaking to a broad concern around the scope of applicability to residential properties. And to the extent that the stakeholder community feels that this regulation should not cover residential properties at all, including non-owner occupied multifamily, for example, that is not likely a change that the department is going to, you know, that I feel that we can embrace if we were to make something of that kind of an exemption full scope in the regulation. So I just want to say that there are some of these things that suggest to me we need to stay at the table and understand where people continue to be nervous and have concern, you know, and try to think through, are there some constructive ways we can address that? But there are some things in here that it feels like we may not be able to meet everything that folks are asking for. So to the extent that we have the opportunity to come back in a week or so and lay out, you know, some of our feedback on this, perhaps that'll be helpful for those on regs review, you know, to understand like where, you know, to the extent to which any of this, any consensus solutions would be appropriate to incorporate into the reg, or the extent to which we may not be able to, you know, we may not be at that place at this time. But I just want to underscore that when we started this whole venture in 2020, there was this word of, you know, especially in the discussions around the working group, you know, there was a lot of discussion about trust, right? And whether we trusted stakeholders or stakeholders trusted DEEP to be able to even have these conversations and try to arrive at constructive solutions, and whether we would be, the department would be open to having stakeholder involvement in the drafting of the regs. And I think it boiled down to, at least in my view, the sense that, you know, the unelected bureaucrats, right, who are sitting here sometimes may not know the realities of what the implementation of these requirements looks like for a property owner, or for a resident, for a business, for the lawyers and the environmental professionals who are advising them. And I think we've come an enormous way over the last several years of like building those relationships and that dialogue. And so that's why I feel confident that, you know, that we can share our perspectives on these lists, that we can continue to work through them in the post-reg adoption working group process, because I hear it from this team that's been getting a lot of deserved praise, that we would not have been able to get to this place without the working group and without all of that discussion and dialogue. And so hopefully that communication and that experience over the last several years gives everyone confidence that we can continue to find consensus and solutions. But I think it's, you know, anyway, so I'll leave that speech there. But that I just wanted to provide that grounding and context in terms of this spectrum of the different issues that have been raised in the white papers, and where the department may be able to embrace some, but may have hesitation on others. But always working towards consensus.
Graham? 4 for 4. No. Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Martin. Representative Maskers, to be followed by Representative Missions.
So well, there are two things I heard. One that gives me some rise to concern was that, as a baseline, a comment I heard is that we've already made a lot of concessions. We're at the end of a marathon. There are probably a baseline I think we need to do is look at a baseline reset of where are we today, how close are we to the finish line, and what takes it over the finish line. So I want us to be flexible to the extent that it fits within the constraints of what we're all trying to do, good work. So that's a concern that the baseline, you know, if I walk into a room and I say this pack of gum is a dollar, and the guy down the street says it sells for a quarter, and I'm say, well, I'll make a concession, I'll sell it at 75, I still haven't gotten to the right place. And I'm not saying a lowest common denominator, I just think I'm happy that we reset a couple of times and had good conversations, which is why I'll talk more about the second piece of the action, which is the review process. And the second piece is, I heard from your comments, Commissioner, correct me if I'm wrong, that there is a potential conversation about residential, and there does look to be a problem in terms of multifamily, in terms of how you would view anything about residential. Was that kind of what I heard?
I think that what I read in the comments, and again, I don't want to, we're just going through these now, but I think that we look at Massachusetts. Massachusetts has no exemptions for single family owner occupied. So in some ways we've adjusted to something that, it's not, I mean, not that we'd have to do everything Massachusetts does, but if we were taking that as a benchmark, I just want to provide that point of comparison. I think in the conversations that we hope to have with our stakeholders, with the stakeholders and with you all, as we provide our responses, we understand, I hear clearly that there's concerns that there's lack of clarity, or that there may be unintended consequences. And anytime we're talking about residential, there's always a concern of ability to pay, right? And how will these requirements be reflected in terms of property values, or risk assessed, at the time of transactions? But we feel in what we've crafted, again, because we heard this issue loud and clear on the draft, and we made the significant changes, in terms of the exemption for single family in response to those concerns that we took very seriously from stakeholders. We think that there's a lot of lack of clarity and vagueness in the current framework that applies. And we think that there are benefits of greater clarity, that there's that can come from this framework that is going to be before the Regs Review Committee. So to the extent that there may be a difference of perspective, that signals to me that there's more conversation, that more conversation could be helpful. And we're, actively thinking through, and that's what some of these conversations that we've been having, even one I had just, yesterday evening with stakeholders, just like, is there some way that we can bridge that gap if it's a clarification issue? And it'd be premature for me to speak to any particular solution, but we're searching for one.
Yeah. I thank you, because obviously that's that's the other place I haven't spoken in the past, but the single largest investment for most people is their home, is their property. And on a commercial basis, it's probably, if I look at that versus a factory, on a ratio of how many factories, how many houses, I probably am flipping and selling, not personally, but it's probably transactionally that much sales activity going on in the state on a weekly, monthly basis. So there'll be, a good focus on the fact that we're not impairing while we're taking care of the safety issues. In deference to the environmental committee, I agree. I'm not looking at seeing toxic properties transacted to retail customers, but that activity level is very high, and the home ownership, the sales generate the conveyance taxes, the residential retail people. I want to make sure we're all get to a good place on that. I think it's got to be a lightning rod, I would think. So I appreciate any conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Meskers. Representative Nishinsky.
Thank you. Worked on this a long time ago when I was chair of Environment Committee. It's a long history on this remediation. But what I remember when we were working on it the first time was that schools were a big problem. And so far I've heard you discuss residential, but municipalities have bought land that was contaminated and built schools on them, and then the state had to bail them out because of the expense of cleanup for the site in Hamden. There was a middle school. In Southington, there was an elementary school, and then there were also residential properties in Hamden. But when that escapes review, and municipalities are just really excited to find a good site downtown, the repercussions are severe. So where are we with schools and parks in this change to this new system of release-based?
That's a great question, Representative, because it is about linking the cleanup to the risk, right? And so schools are, similar to, where you live. You spend a lot of time in the dirt, at least my children do, based on the quality of their clothes when they come home. And what we're framing up here is that there's more clarity if a town were to endeavor to build a new school about what the risk tolerances should be, what the cleanup should be for that individual property, for it to be safe for that purpose. Under the regulations right now, schools and residential are in the same bracket. And so, we feel very confident that the risks are being properly calibrated to the potential exposures. We also feel that the changes to the cleanup standards are going to create more practical solutions so that if a municipality were to discover historical pollution, like has happened at some schools throughout Connecticut over the past several decades, there will be a path forward because municipalities are a partner as well. And what's good for, someone's individual property where they live should be good for the school, right? The same risk standard should apply. And that's one of the things we want to do with this change is create transparency, clarity with what we believe is the standard of care for addressing the most vulnerable folks, particularly as it relates to unfettered access, like on the play yard at school and on your single family home where, where you have more access to the subsurface.
Okay, and then in parks, you have in Meriden, you have a situation where the downtown, which was full of mills, they've all been raised. There's now an uncovered stream there and a public park. So we also have to be careful when we redevelop an area like that into a park where people are going to be sitting on the ground, listening to music and so on.
Absolutely. Now the use of open spaces is a bit of a different risk calculus than a residential or a school setting as well.
How so?
With the number of days that people use a recreational resource, and also most parks discourage shovels unless it's in the play sand areas. And really, when we talk about, environmental pollutants, we talk about routes of exposure. Kids love to dig in the dirt still. So even on a park, we consider the risk associated with a kid digging in the dirt and licking their fingers. I always say, keep your hands off your face, keep your hands out of your mouth, but they never listen. So those numbers are hard coded into the cleanup standards for parks. But they are not, they don't necessarily have to be as stringent as a residential property where we assume someone's going to live for a long period of time and have a lot more contact, both from pollutants that may be in their drinking water wells, maybe in vapors, maybe in soil.
Okay, and then my final question is, the former United Illuminating site in New Haven Harbor, it's on an island in the Mill River. Is that dilemma there where nothing is happening despite all the people complaining in the neighborhood? Is that going to be affected by this legislation? Or is that a separate problem of financing for that site? It's been hanging around for a long time.
So the United Illuminating site, former United Illuminating site on English Station is subject to an order issued under General Statutes 22A432, which prohibits any person from creating or maintaining a condition reasonably expected to pollute the waters of the state. That's not really going to be affected by this change. The department is actively seeking to enforce cleanup obligations on that site and will continue to do so.
Okay, so this legislation won't affect that at all. It's not a matter of concluding a cleanup. It's a matter they haven't even moved.
It's an enforcement. It's an enforcement
Okay.
matter for the department.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Representative Mashinsky. Further questions from members? Senator Lopes.
Thank you. So we have a very complex issue where it looks like we're only going to be able to make most people happy and a couple people unhappy. The good news, of course, that's what we're best at. So this is killing me because as you know, we've discussed, this affects me personally outside of this building. I own properties that will be affected by this, and I still can't come up with a question. It's and as we discussed yesterday at length, you know, the fear of people who own property that are going to be affected is the fear of the unknown. You know, we have faith that it's going to be better than it is. But honestly, as someone who's affected personally, I don't even understand the current process. So I have the fear of the current process, and now I have the fear of a new process that I also don't understand. Is there a way we could, I know it's kind of late in the process, but is there a way we could set up scenarios for people to help understand, like, do non-owner occupied residential property, do a small commercial property, do a warehouse, do a large, and do a hypothetical that I'm going to sell my warehouse, and this is the process that I'm going to follow and what's going to happen. I think as people understand the process, they will become less fearful, and then you're only scared of what you know as opposed to being scared of what you don't know, which is, I think, a little easier to combat.
I have my own cheat sheets of different matrices when it, you know, of right that I think resembles some of the hypotheticals that you've described, and being able to, I think we'd be happy to share, you know, what the current system is, what would change with the release-based framework for these different categories of types of properties, and when we're dealing with new spills, new releases versus the discovery of historical releases, which I think is the latter, is the one where there's the greatest concern and question. So
yeah.
I think that I found it to be helpful for myself in trying to navigate what we're doing here, and happy to share that, and hopefully that will help to illuminate what we believe is like greater clarity and predictability that will come with the new
And
framework.
to assuage fears, I mean, I have a 2-family residential property that I will put for sale this year. What is that process? I want to know, because normally now there is no process with the current system under release base. What will I face as someone doing this process? And this is something that will come up with constituents asking, what do I have to do now that's different than what I had to do before? And I want to be able to answer, hey, this is what you have to do now. And I think that will solve a little bit of the hesitancy going forward.
I would also say, you know, in the last year plus, this group has been on what we've affectionately named the Roadshow, to explain to different impacted groups and communities sort of, you know, previously it had been trying to get feedback on the draft regs. And I think, you know, we're hopeful that once the final regs, hopefully, once the final regs are adopted, we'll pick that back up and start meeting with folks. We're looking for, you know, any opportunity to get in front of audiences like the one you're describing, to explain, answer questions, and to help to make sure that folks are, like, different stakeholder groups impacted throughout, you know, by these new regs, feel comfortable with it and are prepared for the ultimate sort of transition.
I think we might need that before.
Oh.
Because people, the hesitancy of, as people moving forward, is we're going to get calls from realtors and things
Yeah.
like, what do we do now?
Yeah.
What will we be doing differently after this is passed?
So Senator, just to answer your hypothetical that you posed, you know, you own a multifamily and you want to sell that property, what is the new rule, you know, change?
Yeah.
Nothing, right? So you're not obligated. So the way that we've looked at cleanups in Connecticut since the Transfer Act 40 plus years ago is there's certain types of properties that are tagged. And when you do certain things with those, then you have to do an investigation. This new program is more for in the historical release realm, which is what we're talking about, is more about the owner makes a choice to do an investigation, which obviously there's some business reason to do that. And depending upon what you find, you might be in or you might not be in. And so in the future, you know, those properties can be sold. You can, if say you have past environmental due diligence, the buyer can look at it and make a decision without actually collecting samples. If they choose to collect samples, find something, and then become the owner, they would have to then report that if it's reportable. But they don't have to do an investigation to look for historical releases on a site. That is something that we believe is a major risk driver, right? So if there's a very risky pollution source on a property, if you're buying it, you're gonna want to get a bounds on, well, what is this gonna potentially cost me in the future? So you would weigh up that information. You, as a buyer, you could do due diligence, not share it with the owner and say, I'll pass, thank you very much. As a seller, you may be putting up a property that people investigate and keep walking away from. As a seller, maybe you need to make a decision. All right, there's probably something really bad here. I should look and clean it up and then try to market it again. So really, we're trying to give the market forces more control over who comes in for historical releases. So I know that there's a lot of change, but there's still a lot of, there's actually a lot more direct control by property owners than in the past.
Okay, and one of the other, you may triggered another question as usual. For refinancing with lenders, a lot of times it's them asking for the environmental on a property. Will this affect that?
Well, typically lenders would be looking for what's called termed a phase one environmental site assessment. And that's a historical analysis of any potential releases in the past, you know, so you hire someone, you pay $5 grand or $3 grand, and they look at some of the records and they come up with a list of things that may or may not be at risk. You know, lenders will then look at that and they have their own risk tolerances and say, you know, there might be one issue that they want you to look at. There may be no more issues they want you to look at. Doing that due diligence, that phase one type due diligence doesn't trigger the requirement to, doesn't always automatically trigger the requirement to then come into the program.
All right, I'm good. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Lopes, for some real world experience here. Appreciated. Are there further comments? I know you've been here a long time, you're past your bedtime here. Just really quickly, if I might, you can see that the residential is a very big, flashpoint here. And so my question is it better to leave residential as it is now than to put it into this new model and then have to go back and change it? Is it more difficult once you're in the new regime, so to speak, to go back then and do what we have to do to make sure we're balancing human health and the environment and the economic development that we seek to balance?
I feel that, you know, through these many years of engagement, we've achieved that balance with the reg package that we delivered to the Regs Review Committee. I think, as I look at some of the concerns that are raised and even the opportunity to respond to Senator Lopes's question, I think that I'm optimistic that these are issues of perception and clarification about what the obligations will be. But the stakeholders who are raising these have important stakes in this sector. So I want to, you know, get the benefit of those conversations with stakeholders before, you know, we would, abandon our current, you know, position. It's a really important issue, but I think there's concern about how this will translate. And I think we want to have more conversation with stakeholders to help assuage those concerns.
Thank you. Yeah, I thought that would be the answer. I appreciate that. You know, we had this, when I first came into this analogy, you know, the Hotel California analogy. You can go in, but you can never get out. And that is what this Transfer Act has been, to your own testimony about the 5,000 and the 500 that got out. And so that's why I ask about the residential. I don't want to relive this. I want to make sure it's organic and that we are continuing to perfect. Okay. And so when we're now talking about Hotel California, those, whatever they were, 4,500, 3,800, whatever properties, is there a list of those?
Yeah, that's a great question, Senator. So we're preparing that list. Spoke with staff last night about it. They're generating a list of all the names of the properties, street address, town, the date of enrollment in the Transfer Act. Now, some of those sites are not coming out of the Transfer Act because parties in the past were not compelled to complete cleanups until 2013 prior to 2013, there was no end date. There was a requirement to come in, but you never had to clean up. And so from 2013 on, there's an 8-year time period from enrollment to closure. And those set of sites were doing much better than the sites where someone submitted a form in 1986 and then we never heard from them again. The early days also predated the LEP program, so they weren't able to use an LEP. The early days we had to issue each one in order. So, you know, we've come a long way, but some of those old sites, you know, there may be 5 or 6 parties who have, you know, liability under the Transfer Act. So it's also sometimes a waiting game, right? In the future, we want, you know, it to be clearer. If you're the one who creates the release, you clean it up. If you're the one who owns the release and you choose to discover it new, then you clean it up. But when you sell the property, unlike the Transfer Act, you're no longer bound to some obligation to clean up a site that you no longer own. These are some of the nuances and complexities of the Transfer Act that make it not geared towards action.
No, this is very complicated, I understand, and also it's quite frankly generational, so you've got all these layers in here. So yeah, thank you. I would appreciate, you know, I know that's probably a huge task putting that together, but yeah, if we can have the benefit of it, I think that's very helpful. And then, you know, on the staffing, and we talked a little bit about this in approps, because clearly, you know, there's transition here, and I know that you've already have the software. It's not lit up yet though, right?
So thank you for bringing it up, Senator. As I termed it, you know, this is going to be modern age software for people who deal with releases and for the public who wants transparency, right? You've asked for this list. In the future, we hope that would be publicly available as opposed to someone doing queries and access tables. So this is going to be a type of system where if you're an LEP, an attorney, a property owner, you register with the state, you submit information, you know, you fill out these online forms. Who are you? What's your address? Where did the release occur? And then you can not only, you know, submit that to the state, but you can also track through a breadcrumb system where it is in the state's review process. So you're going to know exactly when it clears the first review, or, you know, it's where it is in the auditing process, where it is in the feedback process. And, you know, then you'll have an ability to pay through this online system where we didn't in the past. So there's going to be a lot of efficiencies, you know, not just for the regulated community as they track it, but also for our own staff, so that, you know, we know everything that's on our plate, so nothing drops through the cracks. We will have a state-of-the-art management system on the state side so that supervisors can see what the workload of different staff are and where things are relative to our timeframes for review and response. So we have contracted with a contractor who is, you know, building this system. We are hopeful that this system will be live by the end of the summer, well in advance of the March 2026 start date for the you know, future regulations. And that system is being built not just for new releases that fall under the new regulations, but also for Transfer Act sites. So all those parties who are in the Transfer Act will also be able to have that same functionality and usefulness.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a lot, and very very important, because it will, I think, help to streamline whatever, you know, as we go forward. And then, so it's really important for us to understand, and this is why we talked a little bit about this in appropriations, you know, this transition, because I know once you all get off this assignment, then, you know, you move on, you know, to the next leg of it. But if there is some kind of a penciled out draft hypothetical organizational chart, we need to appreciate that so we can begin to build that in, because it is not in there now. So, you know, realistically, it's important to get it early and then keep beating the drum
another benefit of your leadership on approps as well as commerce and regs review, because
Just
you are
release me.
you're there at the table with us on all of these different elements of successful implementation. We did include in our agency proposal to OPM, as the governor's team was developing his budget proposal, the possibility of up to 6 positions. And that was not included in the governor's budget at this time. But, in our conversations with Secretary Beckham, and this is, our inclusion of those positions was to just flag that we may need more FTEs as we get into implementation. We need to, get further into that process to really identify whether or what additional resources would be needed. And so I think that in the spirit of my conversation with OPM was one of like, well, let's keep talking. It sounds like we don't have enough clarity to know what's needed at this time. But should we get to the point where, further into implementation and a midterm adjustment or into the future, that we've started that conversation. There's an awareness that there may be resources needed, but it was a determination that it's not certain enough that about what resource needs are there to include it at this time. But this is a big priority, as not just for the legislature, for the governor as well. And I know that his team is committed to our success. And the IT tools, the work with the LEPs and the PEPs, for example, there's lots of different ways that we're, I think, confident that we can implement this within the current framework and utilizing those different strategies to achieve successful implementation, timely implementation, to Representative Mesker's first, opening question about ensuring the audits are completed in a predictable timeframe and so on.
Right. So, March 2026, we're talking about, being online, hypothetically. And so we need to start to plan for that. If you are your team that's going to transition is sufficient, or is it durational, or whatever we need, but that's really important part of this if we're going to really be realistic. And you bring up the PEPs and the LEPs, and I would just like to say, and I think recognize this, that they are important parts of this equation and this team, and we have to trust their expertise. As opposed to, perhaps there were times when there was a lot of questioning going on, or whatever it is, they do the work and then we redo it. That's not the model. They are licensed professional individuals for a purpose. And once they are licensed and we are in a partnership with them, we must work with them and trust them and not redo whatever it is they're doing.
We couldn't agree with you more, Senator. And one of the things that we track as it relates to LEP actions is our auditing. And why are audits being conducted? Over 70% of the audits are about the scope of an investigation, which under the new framework doesn't exist, because the sites only come into our regulatory sphere after someone's discovered them. So no more arguing about you should have investigated the loading dock. Well, in 1937, an aerial photograph shows the dumpster was in the back of the building, not the front of the building, so go put borings there. This is literally what we've been working with them on, and that's the conflicts that we've had with them in the past. They are now free to use the prevailing standard and guidelines, which are the national standard, to do that investigation. What they find above reportable thresholds will be what they submit to us through this new online system. We're not going to ask about the other scope of investigation. That's not within the purview of the program, because if it's been discovered and reported, we assume that's the highest risk on the property, and that's what we're going to address through our auditing function. And we need to, and I've told the team this time and again, we need to let them do their business and we do our business, because our functionality is to ensure that the public can understand that these actions are of the state's standard, right? And that is accomplished through auditing. And that doesn't mean looking at every single piece of paper. That means maybe picking some things based on some risky scenarios and picking some things based on some randomness. And that's how an auditing program should and will work in the future, because all we're trying to do is not not scrutinize an individual's action. We're trying to assess the effectiveness of the program. And so I think you're going to see a big shift as it relates to our relationship with LEPs and the new relationship with the PEPs, because that's really the goal of a well-run audit type system.
Thank you for that answer. I much appreciate it. And lastly, I just want to put on the record that, we had a lot of discretionary rulings and guidance and so forth. That creates too much question and anxiousness. And so we don't want to be living vicariously by, discretionary rulings. And then lastly, can I just ask, this being what, today, the 4th, is it possible for you to get back to us on the 11th with this feedback that we talked about versus those white papers that you are working through?
Yeah, I mean, I think we want to make sure we have the time to have the conversations that we're planning on having, but I think certainly, we're happy to get back to you with our initial thoughts by the end of the week. But recognizing that these conversations are ongoing and our kind of responses may adjust as we have those conversations.
Yeah, we don't have any more time, Emma. I appreciate what you're saying, but here we are. Thank you. Representative Meskers.
So implementation, we're talking about hopefully if the ship sails and leaves the port, implementation is June, March.
March 1 of 2026, if the.
March 1st,
legislature-
2026. We sunset the old act somewhere afterwards. There's a duality for a certain period of time, right?
Same day.
Okay, same day. So I know it's not within the scope of your responsibility, but once we get out 6 months, I'd like your personal and professional assessment about LEP and PEP. Do we have enough? And I'd like that discussion with our education department and with our department. I don't know who the licensing agency is. Is it yourselves? Okay. I need to know whether we've got enough people in training, because if you're really good at this, we're going to get those 5,000 properties moving at some point. So I'd like to make sure that we're suitably staffed if we get to that successful point. So just a second. Just more wood for the fire. Sorry about that. But I want to make sure that we've got a functioning private sector that can turn around the answers and get this stuff moving. Thanks.
Thank you, Representative Meskers. Further comments from colleagues? Seeing none. Thank you so much for staying with us for this lengthy discussion. And to be continued. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Appreciate the opportunity.
So without further ado, we'd like to invite Matt Pugliese, who is the Commissioner DECD. Matt, are you bringing with you Vanu? Vanu, hello and good, I guess, afternoon, huh? To you. And you have the floor.
Great. Thank you very much, Senator. I have adjusted my notes to say good afternoon instead of good morning. Chairs Hartley.
Could be worse. Good evening.
True. Chairs Hartley, Meskers, Lopes, and Parker, ranking members Martin, Anaskovich, Harding, Callahan, members of the Environment and Commerce Committees. My name is Matt Pugliese. I'm the Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Economic and Community Development, and appreciate the opportunity to testify on the 3 bills before you today. DCD has been proud to partner with the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection in the effort to adopt the release-based cleanup regulations, which will replace the Transfer Act. And I also want to thank all of the working group members that have given so much of their time and energy to support this effort over the last 5 years. Today, only Connecticut and New Jersey have this restrictive type of Transfer Act legislation, and this regulation distinction deters investment. Regulatory consistency with our neighboring states will make Connecticut more competitive with other markets and reduce compliance costs that slow down transactions. There are many significant provisions in the RBCRs that will expedite timelines and reduce costs for many of the cleanups. Our colleagues got into these details with you a little bit, but They include, from our perspective, the new cleanup standards for managed multifamily properties, expediting the development of much-needed housing across the state, creating a streamlined approach to manage polluted soil below buildings, concrete, and pavement, and creating a new permit by rule that eliminates the need to excavate and dispose of lightly polluted soil when the property is going to be reused for commercial or industrial uses. As Graham mentioned during Deep's testimony, DCD has spoken with the development community about these. We've worked through these scenarios on past projects and they have seen the benefits. They have illustrated the financial benefits, the timeline benefits. We've, as an agency, have discussed these new regulations with municipal economic development and land use staff, and they are all supportive in these provisions that we bring for you in this legislation. They save time and they save money. Our economists at DCD have estimated that moving to a release-based system will have a significant economic benefit for Connecticut. Over the first 5 years, generating more than 2,100 new construction jobs, $3.78 billion in new GDP growth, and $115 million in new revenue for the state of Connecticut. DCD anticipates and emphasizes the importance of the adoption of the proposed RBCRs by the Legislative Regulation Review Committee in the coming months. The stakeholders of the release-based working group have been actively working on this for the last 5 years to address and ameliorate issues that have surfaced when crafting these regulations. Commissioner Dykes has spoke about the comprehensive, lengthy process of stakeholder and public engagement. As we stand up this system now, we're going to need to make sure it works, and we're going to need to be adaptive and responsive. That's what we've heard from you all this morning in your questions. We can't let perfection be the enemy of progress as we move forward. We, as an agency, feel that House Bill 7085 continues the critical oversight of the release-based cleanup regulations by requiring regular meetings to review the implementation and efficacy of these forthcoming changes to the program. And we want to make sure that the program is going to have continuous improvement, and DCD will be there engaging to make sure that economic interests are represented. We urge to continue the progress and momentum of the working group and adopt the new regulations as soon as possible. The Transfer Act has stalled the progress of cleanup and reuse of properties, and time is money. Connecticut is a small state that needs to rely heavily on reuse and redevelopment of properties, putting them back into productive reuse, back on our municipalities' tax rolls. And this reuse is consistent with the state's plan of conservation and development. If the speed of real estate transactions, reuse, redevelopment of potentially contaminated properties in Connecticut can be accelerated, we should act now. I'd like to turn the floor to my colleague, Binu Chandy, DCD's Director of the Office of Brownfield Remediation and Development Director, so that she can guide you through the great work that the DCD Brownfield program will have and its intersection with adopting the RBCRs.
Thanks.
Good afternoon, Binu.
Good afternoon, Senator Hartley. Good afternoon, co-chairs, ranking members, and members of the committee. My name is Binu Chandy, Director of the DCD's Office of Brownfield Remediation Development. I appreciate the opportunity to testify on behalf of Commissioner O'Keefe and DCD's Brownfield Program on Senate Bills 1351 and 1401 and House Bill 7085. The Office of Brownfields was set up as a one-stop state resource to enable brownfield cleanup and redevelopment. The mission of our program is to incentivize the redevelopment of brownfield sites through our funding and liability relief programs. Brownfields are contaminated sites where redevelopment is complicated due to the inherent and widespread pollution in the soils, groundwater, or in the buildings due to the past uses of the site. Our rich industrial past has left us with a number of brownfield sites in the state. We do not have the privilege, like some of the largest states in the country, of abandoning these sites, and therefore remediating and redeveloping these sites is a crucially important economic strategy for the state. These brownfield sites are also located in some of the best locations, like we heard previously. They're located in the downtowns, near transit, and already have an established infrastructure. Connecticut's brownfield program has been highly successful. In the last 10 years, DCD has funded 272 brownfield projects spanning over 75 municipalities with approximately 280 million in funding through a mix of loans and grants. This funding has leveraged approximately $3.64 billion in other funds, resulting in a leverage ratio of approximately $13 invested by non-DC partners for every dollar of the OBRD funding. The funding under Governor Lamont's leadership has been able to support the creation of approximately 1,400 housing units. The proposed release-based cleanup program, or the RBCP, will not have a negative impact on the brownfield funding and liability relief programs, but rather complement our existing programs. The RBCP will be another effective tool for property owners and developers to clean up all levels of contaminated sites up to safe standards in order to prepare them for new end uses. The RBCP presents cost-effective solutions for cleanup of properties that do not have complicated, severe, or site-wide issues, thus attracting private investment for remediation rather than reliance on public subsidies and incentives. All the soil and groundwater cleanup projects funded under the Brownfield program are implemented under the DEEP's Voluntary Remediation Program, that is CGS 22A-133X, unless enrolled into a liability relief program or subject to the Transfer Act under the current regulations. These programs all require site-wide investigation and cleanup. The RBCP framework will maintain exemptions for sites cleaned up under these programs. The RBCP incorporates updates to remediation standards and the new permits by rule. The new regulations also incorporate the significant hazard notification statutes, that is CGS section 22A-6U, but DEEP is recommending continuing to require the statute be applicable for sites in the state's brownfield programs, thus providing clarity and consistency. The new regulations also clarify how newly discovered and created releases on a brownfield site are treated under the RBCP regime. On behalf of Commissioner O'Keefe and the Brownfield Program, I strongly support Bill numbers 1351 and 1404. These two bills propose technical statutory amendments associated with the regulations, which are crucial to the success of the release-based cleanup program. We also support Bill number 7085. If approved in this session, regular reviews and checks from the release-based working group will guarantee that the new release-based cleanup program works well along with the Brownfield program, and DCD will ensure that it is improved, if needed, that is, until we get it right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Pugliese and Banu. Let me just start off with a big shout out to the Brownfields team and to DECD. We really have distinguished ourselves on a national level. It has, and you talked about the ROI and the incredible results of that program every day. I witness it in my community where we've got those chain link fences have come down, and there are shovels in the ground. But it's such an important program. Representative Meskers, who's and the Commerce Committee has been huge champions of this, and also to increase the funding for the Brownfields remediation program, which I think has been pivotal to where we are, quite frankly, as a state with our economy. So I know Representative Meskers has some questions.
Well, it was going to be more a statement than a question. I think you put yourselves in a dangerous place because you promised the flexibility to both review and update the regulations and advocate for the update of the, and my experiences with agencies is they fall in love with the regulations. So once we've built this, I'm going to look at I certainly don't have a quiet voice in advocacy, but I'll certainly look for your help in making sure that whatever, I think we're going to wrestle to a point where we either have close to the perfect or close to the good. Either. I can't quite figure out yet where we go. When we finish that good or perfect, we're going to end up with then Now we're selling it to the customers, and it's kind of like walking into DMV. It's either a good experience or a bad experience. So there's going to be aspects of it that need a fast turnaround, and some may be regarded to, and I'll be looking at your advocacy for things we don't necessarily usually touch again, which are the regulations, because we certainly can much more move the statutes. But I want to make sure that there's a coordinated effort to make sure whatever we've created, that I think it's crucial that we don't go too far down the road with some operational mistake that gets the first 5 clients in the door saying, my God, forget it over there in Connecticut. We want to make sure that the experiential is good. And if it's not, that we can redress and remediate quickly so that, because we want to get these properties moving. Like we've all in agreement. And there is a part of bureaucracy that says, I built it, it's perfect, leave me alone. Right? So I'll look for your advocacy there. So I heard that in the testimony. I wanted to reinforce it in my statement. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative Meskers. Representative Anaskovich.
Good morning. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for your testimony. So somebody new to all this, it's great to hear all the testimony so that we have a better understanding kind of what's going on. And I just wanted to speak a little bit about the residential. I know, Matt, you had said that you spoke to a lot of the stakeholders as it relates to all this. And my only concern on the residential side of all this is that some of the previous testimony talked to the fact of if the property wasn't selling, then it would be up to the property owner then to maybe look into fixing it. So my issue, and something that kind of struck me, was that then what if this individual doesn't have the opportunity to pay for those fixes? So how are we going to be able to sort of, maybe fix that sort of issue or deal with that issue as it arises? So my question to you is that, did you hear any feedback or anything that you heard as it related to this, that where there might be some issues as it relates to the resident?
Thank you very much, Representative, for the question. I think, first off, DCD is working to be in all of these conversations right now with DEEP and with the different stakeholders so that we're hearing directly from the stakeholders what their concerns are, and we can help to be a mediating voice in that conversation as we're looking for the right middle ground or, is the other piece that I would state is that, DCD, as we've reviewed the position that DEEP is at, around owner occupied residential properties, we agree with the risk that's being taken on by the homeowner there. And in terms of rental properties and the risk that is being put on by the owner versus the resident, we understand DEEP's point of view there.
Thank you.
Senator Martin.
Yeah, thank you. Matt, just want to let you know, I don't think without your agency's involvement in this joint effort here, we wouldn't be here today, So I just want to thank you guys, and I hope that you guys stay involved. And then when we have that 1-year review and there are some bugs that need to be worked out, that you guys are there at the table as well. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Senator. And I do want to just respond and say, yes, the agency does want to remain actively involved because we do want this. We do realize that this makes an impact on commerce across our state moving forward. And we don't want us to be locked into regulations that we're stuck with for another generation and that are not adaptive and not responsive to serve the needs of the state.
Thank you, Senator Martin. And so, yeah, just to follow on. So does that mean you are involved in these conversations, which are going to happen over the course of the next week? Because we asked for March 11th for some feedback on this. These white papers are trying to continue to work, and maybe a more expedited, intense fashion, knowing we've got the March 25th date in front of us.
Yes, Senator, we've been working to involve ourselves directly with Deputy Commissioner Cimino when she's scheduling all of these meetings. And we've also been reaching out directly, independently to all of the different stakeholders right now that have these white papers with concerns.
Thank you. So then I really do look forward to whatever these responses are that we're going to get in a week. And I'm being very optimistic about assuming that we're going to have some items significantly checked off that list that's still outstanding. So Matt, question to you, have you reviewed this list of 4,500, I thought it was 3,800, whatever it is, properties that are still in the Transfer Act?
We have spoken with Deep about this list, and as soon as it's compiled, they have promised to share that with us.
Because it's my feeling that when we look at these lists and their locations and so forth, we're going to recognize a number of properties that we have seen fenced up, boarded up, many in urban areas for decades. They are the exact same locations that we are trying to work on with CIF. And so if we are going to optimize every opportunity, I think it's really important that we engage on those outstanding properties, because I think they're probably, very much in urban centers, and they are the legacy properties that have hung out there for so long.
And we're very happy as an agency, Senator, to engage in conversations with the Commerce and Environment Committees, and also with DEEP, to see what resources DCD has with our existing programs that we can bring to bear to help projects move forward and sites move forward, and how we can be part of the complicated calculus that we're going to have to look at as we move properties from the Transfer Act and into the new release-based program.
Yeah, it's really important that we don't get ourselves off in silos, because all of this definitely connects. Thank you very much, Deputy Commissioner.
Rep. Dubitzky has his hand up.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for coming in. It's been very interesting. Now, I apologize that if this question should have been directed at one of your colleagues that testified earlier, I just wasn't able to get it out. So if you're able to answer it, I'd appreciate it. I understand that there are different levels of clean, essentially, one level for industrial, one level for residential, and now there'll be a new one for multifamily. I was wondering where, if at all, farming might come into that picture.
Thank you, Representative Dubinsky. And we're blessed to still have yes, Graham Stevens with us, and I know you're Chief Bureau. I'm not sure your title, Graham.
My title is Graham.
Graham.
Yes, thank you. Representative Dubinsky, thank you for the question. So in most instances, the state categorizes farming as a commercial activity as opposed to a residential activity. Residential typically denotes or implies that there is some sort of housing, right? So, some sort of housing or school use. So in this instance, not only would the cleanup standard for agriculture be industrial commercial, but there is also another cleanup standard that we are introducing for passive recreational uses as well, which I didn't include in my response to Representative Mashinsky earlier, but that too has a bit of a different risk association with it than someone who lives on a property. They may live on their homestead for 60 plus years, right? So a different scenario. So when you deal with a commercial activity, you have different risk assumptions than when you deal with your, home property.
Understood. But with regard to a farm, typically a farmer lives on the farm, so there would be a residential component to it. If somebody were to buy a piece of property and intend to live on it and farm it, how would they determine if the property had been properly cleaned for that purpose?
So the question really relates to due diligence prior to acquisition. So if someone were to buy a farm property with a farm homestead that's on the same parcel, there may be, if they're obtaining a mortgage, there may be certain questions that the lenders may want to know before they lend against this property. And if they're, planning on living there as well, they may have, a risk tolerance and want to know, what pollution they're buying, what their risk exposures may be. So, we have although we're going to be evaluating this group of people's capacity going forward, we have licensed environmental professionals who work with buyers and sellers of property every day in Connecticut to, try to frame up, what is the existing contamination issues on properties before they're transacted. Because just like you would want to know, do I need to put in a new boiler? Do I need to put on a new roof? You're going to want to know, am I buying something that has some liabilities associated with it as it relates to pollution? Even if you don't have to take any action on those now, that's certainly something that most folks would want to know before they make a large purchase.
Understood. I guess that's my question. How do they have to like hire an environmental consultant to go take tests, or is there going to be a list of some sort that a prospective farmer can look at and say, well, this property was cleaned to level 2 or level 3, and because I'm using it for X instead of Y, I'm growing, I'm growing nursery stock instead of food. That level is fine. So is there going to be some type of record as to the level to which it was cleaned?
Yes, we are creating a new online database, which will have all of the information that relates to any cleanups or closures or progress towards that end for any site that comes into the regulatory regime within the department. We also have a list online currently of what's termed contaminated or potentially contaminated sites list, which is an exhaustive list, very exhaustive, of all of the sites where we've ever had a touch point with anyone as it relates to a potential release or an actual release. That then would lead you to do further due diligence about what are the records pertaining to that site. And recently, during the height of the pandemic, the department worked to digitize its records in this sector. These records, which stretch many, many miles in length, were the most requested record that the department maintains, because they are what environmental professionals or property owners come to the department to review to understand what the potential risks with a property may be. So we've now digitized all of those records, so there is an online repository that you can search by address to find out, has anyone ever entered our doors electronically or otherwise to talk about, to report or work with us on releases or potential releases? So from a due diligence standpoint, someone could certainly start their process by, looking at that list and looking at the future database to see, what closures may have occurred on certain properties.
Right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your response. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative Dubisky. Senator Martin.
Graham,
Graham, maybe not so soon. Sorry.
sorry. As I'm listening to Representative and his question regarding farmland, it just triggered something for me. So a developer comes in and he's looking to buy a farm, maybe 50 acres or so. Is there anything that might trigger, or what does the trigger for I guess, now we do a phase 1, phase 2 if it's needed. But is there, I don't know without talking to the bankers, if they're going to be requiring going forward any type of phase 1 for farmlands.
Thank you, Representative. That is definitely a question for the bankers as far as what they would require. There's nothing in the program that would require that anyone buying a farmland would have to conduct a phase 1. I know that when I used to run the state's open space program for some 10 years, when certain nonprofits were buying, former farmland, they did do their due diligence just to understand, if we're going to be opening this property up to the public, what's the potential issues with these properties? And we would work with them on mitigating any risks so that those properties could be used for passive recreational purposes. So, I mean, there is the potential, but just because you conduct a phase 1 doesn't necessarily mean that someone is then going to push you to conduct a phase 2. Sometimes phase 1s are overly inclusive of what might be a potential release, but it doesn't mean that the phase 1 has identified an actual release. And also a phase 2 may or may not actually, return, contamination that's above the lower bounds or any contamination at all. And also the new release-based cleanup program does have an exemption built in for the proper application of pesticides, as opposed to the current framework, which, you can get into the Transfer Act and spend, tens of thousands, 100,000 or more doing an investigation, and the only thing that you find may be, the application of pesticides around the building that you then have to clean up, and you're not even addressing, there weren't even any industrial releases on the site. So, we basically trying to right size the program where some of these societal risks are not going to be part.
My mic is off. Okay, we good? Anybody else on deck for questions? Good. Anybody else on deck for questions? No, seeing none. So the March 11th date, and we really appreciate, your presence working through this as we go forward, and also through the regs process too.
Great. Thank you very much, Senator.
Yeah, thank you. And so at this point, we'd like to invite the mayor of Hamden, Lauren Garrett. Is she online, Madam Clerk? Okay.
Hello, good afternoon. Esteemed co-chair Senator Hartley, Representative Meskers, and distinguished members of the Commerce Committee, and esteemed co-chairs Senator Lopes and Representative Parker, and Environment Committee. My name is Lauren Garrett, and I'm the mayor of Hamden, and I'm testifying in support of HB 7085, an act concerning a review of the release-based cleanup program and regulated regulations. I'm by no means an expert in environmental cleanups, but I do want to provide an example to demonstrate how passing this legislation can positively impact a community. We have a property in Hamden known by a few different names, such as Pine Swamp, Olin Powder Farm, and Six Lakes, to name a few. DEEP has a consent order with Olin Corporation to remediate the contaminated site. The current remediation standard is for residential use, and the only other possible standard is for industrial use. As you can guess from the list of names, the majority of the property is wetlands, and it would not be possible to build housing on 95% of the property. Our hope in Hamden is that the site becomes a public park. The residential use standard exceeds the necessary remediation. It will cost more and will take longer to clean up, while the industrial use standard would not be sufficient remediation for a public park. Creating this intermediate standard for recreational use would speed up the remediation efforts and reduce the cost of cleanup. Additionally, I support SB 1351, an act concerning release-based cleanup remediation standards in lieu of the Transfer Act. Contaminated property should not be ignored until property ownership is transferred. DEEP should have the authority to compel remediation. Again, I want to provide a specific example. We have a brownfield in Hamden on State Street known as the Tire Pond. This property has been under the same ownership for more than 50 years. The property owner accepted 15 to 30 million tires on 27 acres of land, and passage of SB 1351 would give DEEP more oversight to compel remediation. I appreciate all of your time and for proposing this legislation.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Lauren. Any questions for the speaker? Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Felix Reyes from the City of New London. I'm assuming he's online. So we'll see if we put him back in the queue. Keep an eye if we get somewhere. Peter Myers, Connecticut Business and Industry Association. Peter, come on down.
Good afternoon, chairs, ranking members, and members of the Joint Committee. My name is Peter Myers. I am a senior public policy associate at the Connecticut Business and Industry Association, where I typically cover the Environment Committee, but I get to do a little bit of both today, so I'm happy to be here. And I'm happy to testify today in support of House Bill 7085, where we have submitted our testimony, in support of the continuous review of the and fostering economic growth in our state. That has been heard through testimony earlier on today, where you heard that nearly 5,000 sites have entered into the Transfer Act, with only roughly 500 sites successfully exiting. We feel that specifically focusing on those 4,500 sites, there is more work to be done. CBIA is committed to working with this committee and with all the stakeholders and all agencies to find a roadmap to move those sites out of the Transfer Act moving forward. We think that is imperative to fostering economic growth in our downtowns. Now, looking at the Transfer Act moving forward, we do feel that as these regulations are implemented, if they are adopted, these are massive regulations. There's going to be hiccups, there's going to be bumps and bruises, which is why we feel we need the working group to continue to identify that, to provide proper feedback back to the committee, back to DEEP, and then remediate those, forgive my pun there, remediate those concerns as we move forward. And then in closing, I do want to say that several of CBIA's member companies and associations do still have some concerns about certain aspects of these regulations, particularly around certain aspects of the lower bounds and the residential components. Those groups are testifying after me, so I know they can speak better to their individual concerns, but CBIA as a whole does want to see those concerns addressed as best possible now and as we move forward with these regulations so all parties can feel comfortable with these regulations going into effect. In closing, I do want to thank this committee for creating this forum for us to work together with DEEP and DECD as all stakeholders. We think it's really been a landmark piece of legislation to have everyone working together, and we think it's a roadmap going forward to create good policy going forward. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions, and thank you very much.
I'll start with the questions on this. So without going into great detail, the two concerns are the outer bounds or limits, I guess.
Lower bounds.
Lower
yes.
bounds.
Yes.
And the second was on residential.
Yes.
Could you expand a little bit on both of those in terms of your concern?
Yes, so it's certainly something that I would recommend that the environmental professionals can speak better about the lower bounds. It's certainly something that, as the business community, those associations and their members are certainly part of CBIA.
Okay.
And I know those are industry experts, so I do feel like they might be able to better address those concerns on residential and on lower bounds.
Wise of you to defer. I appreciate that. I'll definitely go back and get it from the professional. I really thank you for your testimony and support and raising those two concerns, and we'll pursue that. Are there any other questions from the committee? Yeah. Hold on one second. The chair recognizes the co-chair, Senator Hartley.
So thank you very much, Peter, for being with us today. And you've heard all of the testimony this morning. You know what the outstanding issues are. And, you know, these white papers we've talked a lot about are from the bankers, realtors, and the environmental professionals. Does your organization have a summary of their outstanding issues?
Well, I think it's something that we certainly, all those organizations that you've listed are all part of CBIA. So we do want to see those those concerns addressed. I know those groups are speaking after me, so I believe they probably can speak in better detail about those specific concerns. But for the business community as a whole, we do want to see those concerns addressed as best as possible moving forward. But additionally, we also believe that the working group continuing can help address further concerns, or potentially those concerns don't end up actually being concerning as these regulations go into effect. And I do want to highlight as well that something one of our members pointed out to us, these are several hundred-page regulations. And as they go into effect, we don't know what might be a problem yet. There might be something that has not been identified, which is a crucial part of having House Bill 7085, which is the working group continuing, being effective so we can identify, well, we didn't think about this, that is a problem. So that's something we can address there moving forward.
So Peter, do you have any comments about the proposed fee structure?
Yes, we are aware that the fee structure, and I have spoken with Deep several times about this. We are aware the fee structure is 50% of what is in Massachusetts. And I do think that is something we can continue to evaluate as this goes down the road about maybe these fees are too high, and we do see it is impacting economic development. And that's something we're happy to work with DECD and Deep to address as these are rolled out.
Okay, and back to my previous comment about this, that, once it gets out there, it's harder to roll it back. And so I guess with regard to the fee structure, I want to hear about it now.
Yeah.
Before we are going forward. So that means before March 25th.
Yeah, absolutely. It's certainly something we're happy to take a look at in specific detail and go through every situation of where we could see if fees being capped. We would certainly be supportive of capping the fee structure. I can say for every business in Connecticut, nobody wants to pay more to remediate a site. So we're all happy to create a proper fee structure. So we're happy to work with Deep and get you a specific answer on where we're comfortable with that fee structure being.
So then I'm going to hear from you by next week.
You'll hear from me sooner than that, Senator. Yes.
Thank you. And if you can give us that in a memo.
Yes.
For the benefit of all of the committees.
Yes, absolutely. Happy to do so.
Okay, thanks very much. And if there are no other questions, thank you.
Senator, if I may I address a question from Representative Meskers earlier on the keeping track of sites as they're going through the program? We would certainly be supportive of that. I think it's a great to show and recruit businesses looking to remediate sites in Connecticut. Here's the time frame. I think that would give us a competitive edge over our surrounding states to say, here's how long it takes from entry to exit. Here's how long you can expect. I know you're a finance guy yourself, coming from looking at the ROI for what you're looking for there. That's certainly something that we're going to be able to pitch to businesses looking to invest here.
And thank you very much for that comment, with your permission, Madam Chair. The only thing I'd also don't miss up on the other is that if for some reason your constituent base feels that we don't have a sufficient number of professionals, right, LEPs?
Yes.
That, the state needs to make sure that we are pushing them through the pipeline, getting them educated and licensed.
Absolutely.
So that we run into a licensing shortage because the business improves. I want to make sure that isn't a constraint on it as well.
Absolutely. That's
Right.
certainly something we'll work on identifying there.
Perfect.
Thank you.
you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And further questions, seeing none. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much,
Wait
Senator.
to hear from you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Appreciate that. We'd like to invite, next, I believe it's a panel. No, thank you. Sorry. Okay, Brent, David, and Sam on the environmental professionals. And is that it? Yeah. And if you just identify yourselves when you speak, that would be helpful. Thank you. You have the floor.
Good afternoon. Senator Hartley, Representative Meskers, Senator Martin, Representative Mascovich, Senator Lopes, Representative Parker, Senator Harding, Representative Callahan, and distinguished members of Commerce and Environment Committees. The Environmental Professional Organization of Connecticut, also known as EPOC, is here today to testify on the 3 bills that are the subject of this hearing. My name is Brent Hennebrey. I'm a licensed environmental professional, commonly referred to as an LEP, and current president of EPOC. I am employed by Fuss & O'Neill here in Hartford, Connecticut. I have with me Sam Haydock, our most recent past president. Sam is also an LEP with BL Companies in Meriden. In addition, we have EPOC's Vice President, David Melcher of EKI Environment and Water of Glastonbury. David is both an LEP and a licensed site professional, or LSP, in Massachusetts. We are all working group members. We have all spent the last 4 or 5 years of our life working in concert with the DEP folks and the DECD folks to get to this point. And we're happy we're here, and we're looking forward to helping make this process even better. As you're aware, EPOC represents the interests of more than 300 LEPs working in Connecticut to investigate, remediate, and formally close releases of chemicals and petroleum products to the environment. The role of LEPs is critical to protect human health and the environment while driving economic redevelopment of Connecticut's historically industrialized towns and cities. Regarding the raised bills that are the subject of this hearing today, EPOC supports the concept raised in House Bill 7085, specifically the benefits review and refinement will bring to the overall effectiveness and success of the new release-based cleanup program. We support developing statutory requirements for regular review and reporting back to these legislative committees. With that said, as drafted, the review and refinement will occur after the effective date of the release-based cleanup regulations. We note that the DEP will be spending time between the regulation adoption date, which will likely occur during the first half of 2025, and the proposed effective date of March 2026 to develop all the ancillary forms and materials required for the release-based cleanup program to function, including development of the permitted environmental professional program. During this time period, no working group meetings are required or proposed for stakeholder input on these important materials. EPOC believes that stakeholder input on these materials will be vital for the program to operate effectively and requests that the raised bill provide for stakeholder engagement during the time period between adoption and the effective date. Regarding the remaining 2 bills, Senate Bill 1351 and Senate Bill 1404, they appear to be substantially the same and also appear to be based on language proposed by the DEP to facilitate the transfer from the property transfer program to the new release-based cleanup program. The raised bills make changes to 4 statutory sections. First, the bills propose that the release-based cleanup regulations become effective at a later date, not the date of adoption. EPOC supports this proposal since it will give DEP the time they need to develop all the required ancillary materials, as has been discussed previously. Second, the raised bills redefine the term transfer of establishment in Connecticut's property transfer law to address the fact that Property Transfer Act filing obligations will not be required after the release-based cleanup regulations become effective. Third, the raised bills propose modifications to Connecticut's Certificate Environmental Hazard Reporting Law so that significant environmental hazards continue to be addressed for releases not subject to the requirement of the release-based cleanup regulations, and so that releases are not subject to both programs. EPOC supports these 3 proposed changes. The last change proposes modifying the voluntary remediation cleanup program authorized in Section 22A-133Y of Connecticut's general statutes. The raised bills propose that this voluntary program be made available under certain conditions to investigate and remediate all releases at a parcel together following the effective date of the release-based cleanup regulations. Entering a parcel into this program will significantly reduce the administrative burden of tracking multiple releases at a parcel for stakeholders and DEP staff, as well as reduce required fees for stakeholders. EPOC supports this concept and believes that a parcel-wide option for administration and fee collection will be paramount to the success of this program. It will also create parity with how neighboring states address multiple releases at a parcel. With that said, EPOC believes that the conditions required to enter the program could be relaxed so that more sites could take advantage of the administrative and fee relief. Specifically, the requirement to initiate a parcel-wide Phase 2 ESA within 60 days of the discovery of initial release may not be possible at all sites. To scope an appropriate phase 2 essay, a phase 1 review and records research is necessary, which takes time to complete. In our experience, access and grievance or delays associated with training subcontractors could take more than 60 days on their own. EPOC encourages that the 60-day requirement be extended or removed. Second, to enter the program, a responsible party is required to submit a form to the DEP indicating their desire to enter the program prior to any reporting obligations or triggers in the release-based cleanup regulations. The reporting triggers include reporting within 24 or 72 hours certain types of releases known as significant existing releases. Initiation of phase 2 sampling on a site-wide basis would not be possible in this time frame, and therefore sites with significant existing releases would not be able to take advantage of the administrative and free relief of this voluntary program. The other two reported requirements occur at 120 days if concentrations are of a certain magnitude 2 times the cleanup criteria, or at 365 days for all other releases for which an exemption is not available for that release. To simplify the process, make for a more effective program, and allow as many sites as possible to benefit from the administrative and fee burden relief, EPOC recommends that the raised bills be revised to allow for the use of this program if a site-wide phase 2 ESA is completed and the DEP is notified prior to tier characterization for the initially discovered release at or before 365 days from its discovery. Reporting, which may be required prior to this time, can be completed as necessary in the phase 2 while the phase 2 is being conducted. As a state, our overall goal should be to address and clean up as many releases as possible, and opening this program up to as many parcels as feasible to promote investigation and remediation would be protective of human health and the environment while promoting economic redevelopment for the benefit of everyone in Connecticut. At this point, I would like to turn the floor over to Sam Haydock for additional testimony.
If I might interrupt here.
Certainly.
So we can keep orderly. First of all, have you given us this in written testimony?
Yes.
Okay. This discussion with regard to the, 60 days in voluntary program, is that part of your white paper, the 11 items?
No, the 11 items are with regard to the actual release-based cleanup regulations, not the legislation that is the subject of this hearing.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, those were my questions right now. You know, it's like getting our arms around this, and knowing what the universe is that we're talking about. So, and I know you guys are way in the weeds, and we are not. So we're trying to make sense of all of this and in a prioritized manner. I think Representative Meskers has some question.
As I hit the red button. So that was a lot, and in many ways a little, because it looked like, and I won't say, I was going to use the word arbitrary, but not in an accusatory format. It looks like the decisions seem to be relatively arbitrary on the timeframes currently, and you're suggesting changes in the timeframes that you think are more pragmatic in terms of how it plays out in the field for the consumer. I mean, the review process, the amount of taking a property under a parcel-based review. So none of this, to my mind, has a material impact on health and safety. It looks like it's a process of improving the process of getting there. So it's like steps that you think could be enacted that would improve the process in terms of how we get there, but not necessarily, it's not related to the actual remediation, the toxicity, et cetera. So You just think the process could be improved with those suggestions. So it's good to get those, I guess, as talking points. I don't know if you put them, have you enumerated them or do I have?
What I just read is in testimony that has been provided.
And is it enumerated in terms of broken down each of the suggestions?
Yes.
Okay, perfect, perfect. I haven't seen it written yet. So when I look at it, I want to be able to make sure I can focus on each point. It didn't sound like you were asking for anything other than ways to to facilitate implementation or the ease for the purchase of a property or the person who transacts the property. So I appreciate that. And even though this wasn't your testimony, since I was bandying you people about as LEPs, about what length of process, what's your anticipation if we're successful in this? Do you think the industry is sufficiently staffed in Connecticut?
Well, we're looking forward to seeing the DEP's React system, which is the software system that's going to manage all of this. And we'll be able to have a better picture of what type of staffing needs will be required when we get a chance to see that. It sounds like that'll probably be a little later this summer or fall. But I would think, and I'll let Dave Melcher speak to this as an LSP and was around when Massachusetts went through this transition as to what happened and what should be expected for staffing.
Yeah, I
Dave,
just
if you
want to
don't
make sure
mind.
we have a sufficient number of people who can actually engage the work. But thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Okay, sorry to interrupt this panel. So proceeds.
Okay, David Melcher from EKI Environment and Water. To address Representative Mesker's question, kind of the long way there, and I apologize for that, but Massachusetts went through a very similar process where they redid their entire program. They just did it in 1993. What they saw in 1993 was an additional 1,500 to 3,000 new releases reported every year. They're about twice the size of Connecticut, both economically and geographically. So Connecticut could be seeing between 750 and 1,500 new sites per year. The total number of LSPs in Massachusetts peaked at about 500. There are currently about 300 LEPs in Connecticut. They will be very busy under the new regulations, but do we have enough staff to address the surge of work that we anticipate to see coming once all of these properties are regulated by the RBCRs? We'll try.
And then you may proceed if there are no other questions at this point. Go ahead.
Okay, we'll turn it over to Samuel Haydock.
Can I just ask you, do we have one submission on your testimony or individually did you each give us testimony?
You have one submission.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Steve, commissioners, members of Commerce and Environment. I'm Sam Haydock. I'm a licensed environmental professional with BL Companies. First, I'd just like to say that EPOC supports the sunset of the Transfer Act, and we support the transition to new regulations. I would like to add that as LEPs and environmental consultants, we have the experience both in Connecticut and neighboring states to foresee pitfalls and issues associated with the proposed release-based cleanup regulations that will make the program, if not changed, the proposed program less successful than it can be. And our concern is that it could potentially also place Connecticut at an economic disadvantage. We support the proposed legislation that is before this committee today to allow an opportunity to make the release-based regulations better after adoption, but we believe it would be better and more effective to make changes and address issues before adoption. We all know that it is hard to revise statutes and regulations once they are implemented, and we know from experience with the release-based remediation standards, or with the existing remediation standard regulations and the Transfer Act, it's very hard to fix it after the fact. With the third draft, so we believe it would be better to make changes now and to address outstanding issues associated with the third draft, some of which are listed at the end of our testimony before adoption. One of our main concerns, which we have been raising from almost day one of the working group, which was 4 years ago, is that we still do not have a full understanding of the final regulatory framework. We've come a long way. We started with concepts, individual concepts and white papers, and we've slowly stitched them together to create a framework for this regulatory process. Yet it is agreed, and we heard even today, that the third draft of the RBCRs, the release-based regulations, still need work and still need some fixes. And here we are discussing pending legislation, some of the concerns associated with which Brent just discussed. And lastly, we still do not have supporting and ancillary materials. When our clients ask us today, what are the new regulations going to be like? How will the new framework work? Should we wait to sell our property in the future? Should we sell our property today? We honestly don't have an answer because we still don't understand the full and complete regulatory framework and how it will work. So we believe that all of these components of the regulatory framework should be available before, not after adoption. Having the opportunity to address them after adoption is good, but not as good as trying to make changes before we get to that point. Thank you.
Does that conclude your panel remarks?
Yes, it does. We're happy to take any further questions you have.
Okay, thank you. All right, so Sam, you don't understand the regulatory framework. That's pretty alarming at this stage, after these number of years and work and your participation. And so we've got a white paper from you all. Thank you. 11 points that, if I'm understanding this, that are still unresolved, outstanding. We spent a lot of time having a conversation with the department and the commissioner this morning about where we are now and where we are going, knowing that we are now in crunch time because it's March 25th that these regs will be first acted upon. What's going on with your organization and the department, both departments, but primarily DEEP?
So I will backtrack slightly to say that we have a framework and we understand the goal of the framework and we understand the major components of the framework. As Representative Meskers indicated, we are getting into the weeds and we are at a point where the details matter. And the details matter to the point I just made, where when someone asks us, how will this work? We can give some general understanding of it's a release-based program. You have to have a spill. Once you identify the spill, you have the opportunity to move it through the program to closure. But there are details missing, and some of those details we feel are very important, particularly things that have been mentioned today, such as lower bounds is a concern for us. The multiple lines of evidence for entry into the program is a concern for us. So certainly the department is aware of our concerns. I think we did break it down into 11 concerns after the release of the third draft. Certainly some of these have been discussed in work groups meetings that have happened since the third draft came out. Not all of them have. And I guess Dave or Brent, correct me if I'm wrong, but at this time there is no ongoing discussion. And it was my understanding that there was no further opportunity to do so at this time.
Okay, so I'm understanding that there is ongoing conversations. And if you're not in there, I would strongly suggest to the parties that we ASAP get around the table. Now, you put those 11 points out in your white paper. I mean, I would anticipate that there, because I'm asking for some feedback on these white papers by next week, that you would be in the room working through these 11. My request to the commissioner was to take off as many of these as possible and then to then understand what we are left with. So quite frankly, we don't end up with a bill with all of this in it. So I'm saying to the departments that you all, I know how hard everybody has worked, but this is the last leg of the marathon. Get in there, get your power drinks with you and get in there. Because I'm still waiting for this response on March 11th. Questions from colleagues for Representative Meskers?
I want to repeat what I said before to make sure. So there's 11 points out there. What you presented on terms of the packaging of parcels is not part of the 11 points.
No, the 11 points were prepared specific to the release-based cleanup regulations themselves, which are now in front of regs review.
Okay.
The testimony we provided today was related to the 3 bills that are before Environment and Commerce and our comments on those.
I'm glad you said that slowly to me, so I processed it better. So it's on the regulations. But again, referring back to the committee, it sounds like the regulation suggestion is a regulation to provide for consolidated treatment of a parcel and timeframes that would be suitable for the nature of how that stuff is remediated, maybe in Massachusetts, et cetera. So you're asking for, basically, it's kind of a 1-2 change. It's a couple of time response changes and inclusion of the whole parcel, if I want to simplify it.
Yeah, to simplify our requests with regard to the review period that is discussed in the House bill, we would strongly recommend that take place during this time period between adoption and
was the third
effective
piece.
date. And that, we have the ability to continue to assist DEP with the generation of those materials and production of those materials. And then with regard to the site-wide program, we would like to open that up to as many parcels as possible. The way sites are going to get into this program is through due diligence. And that's the way it occurs in Massachusetts. Banks and lenders are going to want to understand what they're lending on, and they're going to require folks to do assessments. Those assessments are going to result in the collection of data that is potentially going to make these sites reportable. So, and that type of due diligence is done on a site-wide basis. So typically, there will be one-offs where releases are found on their own for various reasons, but I believe the lion's share of releases will be identified during the phase 1-2 due diligence process.
Right. And you think the banks could trigger a parcel check, an overall survey of the parcel is what you're saying?
You cannot get a commercial mortgage from a bank today without doing an environmental site assessment unless you have very, very good finances.
And you didn't make this a big point, so I've kind of strung it together from your commentary, or I'm either that or I'm a slow learner. But your concern of not getting back into the table in the mix until the regulations are published, or is that also the supporting documentation? So, I mean, I'm worried whether we develop forms and process without a feedback loop. Are you going to be left with a fait accompli if we don't include you in from now through the opening date, if you will?
Yeah, that's precisely our worry. And I believe that the department has indicated that they will include us, and they have in the past, and we're supportive of that and thankful for that. But it feels like that it needs to be more of a formal program, like the program that we've been through for the past 4 or 5 years. This whole program, it consists of 3 parts. It consists of the regulations themselves, which are in front of regs review. It consists of the legislative changes that we're here to speak about today, and all the ancillary materials that allow it to actually function, to go from regulation to actually move the site through a program. That part of the process has not been vetted, and DEP is working on it, and I know they've had a lot to do dealing with the first two parts. We're just asking to be part of that process in a formal way as those documents are generated.
Thank you. I think it's personally, I could say, in my role as co-chair, I think it's an important request, simply because when we're generating all of the material to comply with the regulations, I think we know as professionals what we want to accomplish, but what the form looks like and how it's interpreted from the other side, it could be widely different. I've seen that process happen time and again in my own life, where I was the one generating the form and I was conceptually not reaching, or the person filling it out had no idea what my goal was there. So I want to make sure that I can appreciate what you suggested, but thank you.
With that said, Representative, so I don't believe we need to have monthly meetings of the work group like we have in the past. But, even the quarterly time period that's suggested for the review after they become effective would be fine with us leading up to the effective date. But we be part of the generation of those materials and for the best for our profession, our livelihoods, and state of Connecticut. So.
Yes, thank you, Representative Meskers. Representative John Michael.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, folks, for all of your engagement in all this along the way. And so I'm understanding the conversation about the legislative proposal and the feedback in your testimony today, something that we can certainly review. And I would agree with my colleagues that your request to be included in the intervening months before the start date for all this makes a lot of sense, and would hope that and believe and would hope that DEEP would be able to include that in what they come up with. So then my question is concerning the other piece of feedback that we're getting in terms of the white paper, which I believe is specific to the regulations themselves. And so in your engagement in these intervening months and into the future, is there an opportunity for another way to continue getting into the details around some of these regulation pieces, specifically the use of guidance documents, I believe, as a way to sort of update this work as it's going along? I'm curious, are there pieces in your white paper of those 11 that could continue to be modified even after the regulation date that we've got looming in front of us in the next couple weeks?
I'm struggling to answer because you're kind of mixing a couple different things.
Great, help me understand.
So we would love to know if there's an opportunity for the regulations themselves to be changed. We understand that they've been reviewed by the Attorney General and that they are in front of regs review. And I think the Commissioner and Deputy Commissioner discussed this morning that it probably won't be possible to make significant changes to the regulations now that they're before regs review. This is a civics lesson for me. So any clarity that can be provided around that, we'd be happy to listen to that. With regard to all the forms and documents and guidance and instructions that need to be generated over the next 9 months, certainly those don't need to be approved by regs review and can constantly evolve. So the department has provided a release-based cleanup guidance document, which is about a 30 or 40,000 foot view of how to address releases under the new release-based program instead of whole sites. And that's a good document. We've reviewed it. We've made some minor suggestions and provided that to them. But unfortunately, that's the only document we've received so far. And there's a lot more material that ultimately needs to be generated. PEPs are brethren who are going to be out there working with us on the less complicated releases. We're still waiting for information on that and how that's going to evolve. One of the big changes to the regulations is the ability to use human health risk assessment to close sites. Many sites are closed in Massachusetts using that method. We're waiting for the department's materials on how exactly that's going to be done. And having that type of information will allow Sam to be able to tell his clients, well, it looks like this is going to be a pretty good thing. It's going to be pretty easy to do. Therefore, maybe you ought to go ahead and wait on selling your site until this comes through. So these are the details that we're looking for. And I know the DEP has been busy and they continue to work to make these materials. We just want to have an opportunity to see them before they get final.
Thank you for that response. I can't, as sort of we're both acknowledging here, working our way through this, I don't have the exact answer right now. I hope that our friends from the department are listening in and we'll be able to follow up and clarify some of that. But I'd like to think that's a place to continue that work. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative. Further questions from colleagues. Okay, you're not in, ideally, are you asking for some kind of official work group between now and the adoption of the regs?
Our understanding is that when regs review theoretically approves these regulations sometime over the next coming months, they will be considered adopted. Public Act 20-9 indicates that the working group has to continue until the regulations are adopted. It does not have to continue after that. And based on conversations with the department, we understand that they plan to stop the working group and use that time to develop all the ancillary materials. And so they could be ready for the March 2026 effective date, which is what they've asked for in the from regs review as part of that process. So we're just looking to be for a formal process for us to continue to work with them during that intervening time period.
Right. Okay. And I believe it's our anticipation, that is the legislative committees, that what is it? HB 7085 will trigger a continuation of the working group, not effective upon its effective date, which means that is before the effective date of March 26th. If we adopt this by the end of this legislative session. So it's our anticipation that you are going to be, there's a continuation of the work going on. Now, the question was raised, can the regulations be changed? And we heard from the Deputy Commissioner that in all candor, that we are not going to be changing the regulations. That's not the process. However, we need to continue to work because on the legislative side, we can put proposals out there which would trigger the correction, the edification of regulations. So it is a civics 101 on your end. I get it, because you guys are experiencing the civics part of what we're experiencing on the technical environmental part. Trust me, we are like, barely breathing here. So we all got our issues.
Madam Chair?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just to clarify for my edification here, the request in the bill that were before us wouldn't become effective till June. So there is a time frame where you're saying the regulations would be approved on March 26th. We'd probably be in June when we would, when the working group could be reanimated. No, I mean, there is a lapse period.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Just wanted to understand that.
However, if I might, on the record, there is full discussion about continuing to work. And maybe we don't have the exact legislation by which we're marching to, but to continue to be in contact and work. For example, I'm asking for a response on these white papers by next week. And I'm expecting that the continuation between the stakeholders and the regulators continues, be it, spelled out in a Senate or a House bill. This is too complicated. We had this period after submission of the regulation from the public input part. and we termed it a blackout period. And I understand this because there was an immense amount of public response that the department went through line by line holidays. And so we didn't hear anything during that time. You know, and then we had the submission when we had the look at what the actual regs are. So I expect that we all are still, you know, at the table. There's no pencils put down. And we work through this. Now you talked about, you know, the missing details. You know, is that actually, Dave, the actual forms and documents that you're looking for? That's what you're talking about? And I mean, they, I guess, are being worked on.
They want to be in the creation.
Yeah. So once again, I'm asking that you continue to work. And if you are not being part of those conversations, I personally want to hear about.
Understood, Senator.
Thank you. Comments. Okay, so just lastly, can you help us out with a kind of 101 on LEPs versus PEPs?
Certainly. So LEPs, the LEP program has been around since 1996. Essentially, Connecticut has a privatized system where we are deputized by the DEP to supervise the investigation and remediation of spills, most notably subject to Connecticut's property transfer law, but there's also some brownfields and brownfield programs and voluntary cleanup programs that we're also allowed to supervise the investigation and remediation and sign off when we're done with what we call a verification. So we do not do a lot of work in the other just as large area of pollution where spills occur every day on our highways, releases occur at gas stations. Those are known as contemporaneous, or the new term is emergent releases. Those spills are handled typically by emergency response contractors that have contracts with the DEP and are permitted by DEP. And what the idea behind the release-based cleanup program was to bring those two worlds together. Now, as LEPs, we don't want to sign off on every small spill in the state. That's not good use of our time. So we work through this process with DEP to develop another group of professionals called PEPs, permitted environmental professionals, that will be allowed to supervise and sign off on the smaller spills that occur statewide. We probably have tens of them that occur every day in the state due to motor vehicle accidents and other mishaps. And where the friction has been is the dividing line between how far up the risk ladder does a PEP get to go before an LEP has to take over. And I think we found a good balance on that. Certainly any situation where groundwater remediation is required will be handed off to an LEP, as well as there being a very prescribed set of methods and goals that have to be achieved for a PEP to certify a release, is the technical term that's used in the regulations. So I think we've reached a good balance there, and it's just understanding exactly how the PEP process is going to work that we're looking for the details on what type of qualifications, continuing education. One of our comments is around the auditing of those decisions and what level of auditing is sufficient for a brand new program. In some instances where facilities are self-certifying their own releases, facilities are going to be able to have their own PEPs. So we still have some questions around that. Is that helpful, Senator?
Yeah, it creates other questions too. So emergent spills are done by LEPs or another category?
Currently, emergent spills are addressed by spills contractors that are permitted by the DEP.
typically, if I may, Senator, what's really important for this whole program is acceptance by the marketplace. As you've heard today, it's going to be the marketplace that is largely driving due diligence, that's largely driving investigation of properties. And it's the marketplace that needs to be able to accept the work that gets completed at the end of the day so that they can manage their risk and continue on with commerce. And we've had a history in the past where there are spills that are mitigated or closed. In other words, the active spill is stopped. But historically, it's not uncommon to have to go reinvestigate spills as part of a property transfer transaction or a verification or some other reason for testing to confirm that the work that was done actually fully addressed the release. Because typically when you close a spill under the former program, it stopped the release. If it was really bad, it may get referred to the remediation division for further investigation and remediation. But there was a gap in closure between closed spills and a full verification or a certificate or a statement of compliance by an LEP. And so the PEP program is designed to try to bridge that gap so that spill contractors can close spills, smaller spills that mostly impact just soil. There's a very defined set of circumstances where PEPs can do their work, and we generally agree that that's the right dividing line. But we want to make sure that when PEPs certify that a release has been cleaned, that it is accepted by the marketplace. And part of what's missing in that equation are, again, details on what PEP's level of experience must be, what their training must be, what their continuing education must be. And I think that's where we still raise concerns about the PEP program. We don't object to it in concept at all.
Thanks very much, Sam. So Graham, I know you're still in the room. And so I'm just wondering, is that been defined yet? I would think we're kind of far down the road here with this model that we wouldn't have that flushed out yet.
All right. See, Senator, you're assuming I was paying attention to the conversation, which I was. I wasn't catching up on email. Yes, we have provided some preliminary framing to the working group, including EPOC, on the credentials that PEPs would need to have to obtain a permit to sign off on the work that they today conduct. Right. And I think that's one of the things that we tried to talk about earlier is this durable closure. Because right now, what doesn't exist is you can have a tanker truck rollover and someone cleans that up with no sign off. But you can also have a release on an industrial property. Someone cleans that up and there's no sign off. And then these LEPs, if they're ever brought onto that same property, the first thing they'll have to do is, because there's no durable closure, is to conduct an additional investigation to see what may have been left in place when the emergency was addressed. So we have provided the training and the ongoing, our thoughts on the training and ongoing education that these PEPs would need to obtain a permit. And the one thing that distinguishes PEPs from LEPs is not just it's a bit of a different field, although it's all releases. Is that they're going to be permitted as opposed to licensed. So the department has a tremendous more control over that group because they're not independently licensed. We have just as we have with our permitting authorities, the ability to suspend or revoke if someone violates their permit. We feel confident that, this program will need some attention in the startup and probably will need greater scrutiny and oversight as it relates to audits. But we also believe that the scope of their remit is very targeted and is manageable to make sure that, anything that becomes complicated whereby it hits the groundwater or, impacts more sensitive resources can be addressed by other professionals.
Graham, just tell me, in your example of a spill on the highway and something that is not signed off on, how come, how do we not have closure on something like that?
We have an elimination of the status as an emergency. And, you know, to the credit of the folks who are doing this cleanup every day, I would say that they are cleaning up all of the pollution. The question is documentation and administrative closure, right? Because the practice in the field with respect to new releases is to remove all of the release from the environment. Historical releases are complicated because we don't know exactly how much was released. We don't even necessarily always know what were the compound components of what was released. It had time to move in the soil, the vapor, and the groundwater systems for sometimes decades. So really wrapping our arms around where is that release exist in the environment today is a very complicated scientific process that the LEPs go through. When we have new releases, you know, it could be that drum right there just fell over and landed right there. I can see the spill on the ground, and I'm going to come in. I'm not going to sample it. I'm going to come in and I'm going to excavate it. And I'm going to excavate it. I'm going to take 2 or 3 extra scoops because that's what the approach is, and that's the capability in dealing with a new release as opposed to trying to investigate and address historical releases. So I have great confidence that, you know, new releases, they usually go over excavate, we call, to get all of what was released. If there's a situation where, you know, they're retrieving product, they're comparing what they pump out of the ground to what went in the ground, and they don't stop until they have the confidence that they've retrieved all the amount that is retrievable. So really now the new system is, how do we get the paperwork and the auditing with respect to that paperwork so that in the future, we hope that the banking community, the property owners, and the LEPs will have confidence that they don't need to go back and reinvestigate those past cleanups.
Hey, Graham, I still don't know how you close out a spill on the highway.
Well, you dig until you get it all is basically the way it works. And you know, that thankfully, you know, we have these, you know, we have spill response unit at DEEP who are, you know, trained and able to lead the cleanup of these releases. And, you know, we bring in contractors when it's a significant, you know, issue or what, you know, some folks who transport materials on the highway have their own firms that come in and do the cleanup. It's part of their business anytime they drive on the highway with these materials. And we're there overseeing that cleanup. So they're digging essentially, and they're loading the impacted soil into trucks, and they're taking it to landfills for disposal. And they're testing the soil to make sure they have it all. And then they're bringing in clean material to reestablish that you know, the shoulder of the highway or wherever the material may have been impacted.
So, hey, Graham, so you've heard all this conversation, and so the environmental protection group is saying that they don't know what the qualifications are and the certification for the PEPs. That's got to be somewhere. That's got to be.
We have provided that to the working group. Our proposal on what is the credentials and ongoing training that is necessary to be a PEP. And we've sought feedback from the working group on that. And we will continue to have that dialogue because that is one of the things that yet we have not developed the permit that spells it out exactly with all of the X's and O's on what someone would need to achieve in order to obtain that licensure, that license, that permit. But that is something that we certainly are planning on engaging with the working group on. And just to another point of discussion earlier, as far as like the missing piece, you know, Sam said regulatory piece is missing, the forms and guidance, I think he meant in this case. You know, we have a meeting next Tuesday. I'm sure, I hope we'll see some of you there, where we're going to be rolling out this system of our forms. You know, that's the REACT system, which has a great acronym, which I can't remember all the words that it stands for right now, but that is your release anyway, I won't try to spell out the React, but it spells React. And this is the system that contains the forms. And there's a big shift in how we're going to be using forms going forward. In the past, there was a lot of form, reliance on complicated forms. We're trying to really shift to a new system. And because this system knows who you are and knows what release you're talking about and knows what the compounds are, a lot of that information is going to be self-generated through the computer system. And so really it's just, we already know what the release is. We already know what was contained in the release. We already know the information you submitted the last time around. What did you do to close it? Attach any, supplemental information and, load a, copy of your license, because when LEPs, make a decision, they affix their professional license to those decisions. So, I mean, that's the extent of the forms. It's a preview of what we'll talk about next Tuesday at 1 o'clock if anybody wants to join. But that will be an ongoing conversation that we have with the working group. And, there was also the talk about, this intervening period between adoption of the regulations and effectiveness and the effect on the working group. I mean, as much as we would be hopeful that the Regs Review Committee approve the regulations, on March 25th, we assume, as is the custom and practice and the expectation, that there will be, a rejection without prejudice and a requirement that we resubmit. That may, in fact, based on past practice with the remediation standard regulations, take multiple iterations. And so we believe that, the best case scenario for the regulations being adopted would be closer to the June timeframe. Hopefully, after the legislative body has acted upon this change, the 7850. I get the number wrong on the continuation of the working group. That said, LEPs are our closest partners in cleanup. And certainly, the door never closes as it relates to this, incredibly important initiative, which, as we've said time and again, we wouldn't be here without these stakeholders, right? Their on the ground expertise is something that is absolutely critical to our success. We wouldn't have invested 5 years of monthly meetings and all the prep and post work for all of those working group meetings if we wanted to shut the door and have any blackout period.
Representative Meskers.
Sorry, Graham, take advantage that you're here. Having listened to the conversation about parcel, non-parcel, et cetera, and closing. So that connecting the dots, obviously the lack of a closing document is going to definitely, I would think, spark the bank to subject the entire parcel to a survey, right? And we're comfortable with the nature of the closing document. That's been a conversation with the banks. I want to get, I'm comfortable you're managing toxicity better than I ever will in my life, So I guess the question is, are we comfortable that we'll be able to give the banks representation so we don't have to go back to Groundhog Day once we've closed a site and make it financeable?
Our sincere belief and hope is that, any closures under this regulatory program are durable, right? That's something that the working group has said from day one.
Okay.
They want market certainty on any action that anyone takes. The last thing we want is someone to expend money to reach a regulatory closure point and then not have market acceptance of that. That would be a failure.
No, I trust you. That's why I'm just
Yes.
fleshing it out. And I'll have that conversation with the banks. I want to make sure that if they need us to do something somewhat more at the point of the spill and certification, I just want to make sure that that document works with, not that it just works for the toxicity, but it works from not having to go back and retest the site because the bank has an issue. So I don't doubt you. I want to make sure that, I've been in banking. I know sometimes it's belt suspenders
Right.
and God knows what else. So I'd like to make sure we can get their financing closed out and not forcing a retesting when you guys feel completely comfortable that we've remedied the situation.
And I totally agree. And today there is retesting, and that's something that we want to do away with. So
Well,
thank
there
you.
were a couple here today. I'm going to drag them and have that
I have seen
conversation?
them in the
Okay,
room. Yes, sir.
great, thank you, Graham.
Thank you. Yes, Representative John Michael Parker.
1 second, sir. I'm going to follow up and take advantage of you being here too. Not that I don't want to speak to our other friends up here. Just to be clear on the conversation that we had before a little bit around these ongoing clarifications through these documents that are going to be created. I mean, is it common for you to take the feedback from these folks? Are you willing to commit to continuing to take that as you continue to work forward on this? Is that part of your process anyways?
We are committed to continuing to work with, you know, these partners that we've been working with since, you know, the LEP license was established, right? This was something that the department supported. We believe that that's the right approach for cleanups in Connecticut. Not all states have a licensed professional that acts in this space. Massachusetts, as we heard, does. New Jersey does as well. And, you know, I look to our future where not only does Connecticut have the best brownfield program in the entire nation, but we also have a strong LEP program with a strong relationship with the regulated entity. And we have a release-based system that we unshackle ourselves by eliminating the Transfer Act. And then all of a sudden, Connecticut goes from an outlier in the negative to an outlier in the positive as it relates to the cleanup and putting back into productive reuse these derelict sites.
I'm inspired by that vision. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks for all your work.
Graham,
Yes, Senator.
sorry. So I thought earlier we heard from one of you, one of the four, regarding that you guys, through all this deliberation with the stakeholders, that the document that we have in front of us, the regulations, you've gone as far as you would regarding input from the stakeholders. Did I hear incorrectly?
One of those four was possibly my boss's boss, so I'll be careful on how I speak. But I think that she was speaking directly to the scope of the residential exemption. And I think that it's important that, you know, the department be given a little bit of leeway with Senator's date in mind to have that conversation, follow-up conversation with the realtors and the bankers as it relates to the residential exemption and the potential expansion of that scope. Because there are, you know, it's a complex regulation. There's a lot of additional nuance than just what's a strict exemption and what's not a strict exemption. And so I think we have, you know, already had conversations with the realtors and the bankers. And, you know, not that we didn't have the memo from EPOC, but the day before we had a similar meeting with EPOC. And those conversations will continue. So, you know, we're not closing the door on conversations, you know, but I think the commissioner did indicate that, you know, expanding the exemption for residential is not something that at this point we feel is the right thing to move forward with.
Okay, thank you for the clarity. Thanks.
Thank you, Senator Martin, and thanks. Hopefully we won't call you back again. If that's not happening, because we're all in real time here and we're on the clock, we need to hear immediately. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity, and we appreciate your leadership. Thank you.
Thank you all. We'd like to now invite the Connecticut Bankers Association, Art Quarry, and Art has some company. None other than the Connecticut Realtors being represented. We're so happy to see this team before
I
us.
was going to bring Graham with me, but I wasn't sure if you want to see it.
Don't worry, he's probably not going to be able to
I'll save
speak
the
out.
seat for him.
You have the floors.
Senators Hartley, Senator Lopes, Representatives Mesker and Parker, Ranking Members Harding, Martin, Anaskevich, and Callahan. My name's Art Quarry, General Counsel, Connecticut Bankers Association. As we know, I'm joined here by my counterpart over at Connecticut Realtors, Jim Heckman, a good friend and partner in this project for some time with us in reviewing these bills that are before you today, but also, as has been discussed quite a bit today, the regulations that are related to those bills. I first want to say that I think I can speak for the realtors as well. We are very committed to seeing the Transfer Act being replaced by something that is better. The Transfer Act, as was referred to, I think, by Senator Hartley before, the Hotel California needs to close. We also want to recognize the work that DEEP and DECD have done. We want to thank them for the generosity of their time and knowledge, particularly Jim and I are not environmental lawyers, so they have been very generous with their time, including recently, and their commitments ongoing to talk, including this week and perhaps next week as well. I want to make one comment on one of the bills today, House Bill 7085. We think it's critically important that the working group continue its work for the next 5 years. I think, as has been mentioned today, certainty is one of our chief concerns, both for the residential market, the commercial market, and I think that it's unknown how this is all going to play out, and so we think that the presence of the working group will be very important going forward. With regard to the regulations, you've heard that we are engaged in ongoing conversations with DEEP. I think Deputy Commissioner Semino sent me a text or an invite to talk tomorrow while we were waiting to come up and talk, and so we will certainly be doing that. But we have focused our concerns on just a few issues, maybe 5 or 6. Some of you have seen the white paper, as has been referenced earlier, that we have still remaining concerns over, including the residential exemption. And we will be continuing to talk with DEEP about those. Again, they've been very generous with their time and knowledge and their openness to continuing to talk with us. I'll let Jim make any comments.
I just would echo Art's comments and our concerns and related to the memo, and our appreciation of both DECD and DEEP in talking with us and trying to work this out.
Thank you very much. And so you bring up the residential piece, and I can't emphasize that enough. That is crucial that we have clarity on that and that we are on the same page. We understand what's going to go on and we're not blindsided by unintended consequences. We've got this discussion of owner occupied, single family owner occupied, and then you go into kind of this next category of up to 4 multifamily, to 4 units, but they're not necessarily owner occupied. And I think in my own town of the World War II construction of the 3 Deckers up and down the hills there. Some are owner occupied, many are not. And they are, quite frankly, maybe they live next door or in the neighborhood. But they're small businesses as well. And so this is a big concern in terms of how I've heard the testimony over and over again that, residential was always in the Transfer Act. That was not the understanding when we took this on in 2019, that it was the commercial industrial. Residential was never part of this conversation. And so this is a real flashpoint for me. I'll just say that right now. And that's why there's got to be some understanding and certainty beyond good faith. So I'll refer to my co-chair, Representative Meskers.
So I think you heard my prior commentary. So now I'm going to lean in on both of you that whatever we're doing in the way of closing out a spill, that the documents and the certification from a PEP or LEP, I'm assuming it's mostly PEPs, that you're happy with that permitting and closure process, and we're not going to have to go back and do soil testing on the whole parcel, that you guys would be relieved to have a permitted official say, that it's resolved.
I think that's part of what we're talking about with them this week. And
Okay.
I agree with your point on market certainty. I mean, we don't want to see a property stigmatized at all. So that's what we're trying to avoid. So we're in discussions to make sure that doesn't happen.
I'm less worried about the property being stigmatized. I can see the DEP doing their work to get the right permitted person to resolve the issue. And I can see, even though I was a banker, I can see a banker or a real estate guy saying, oh, let's belts and suspenders, let's mandate another. So I want to make sure you're happy with the certification. I trust the process on that side. I'm not sure that that's the process and the certification will be sufficient and necessary to get us to clearance.
Well,
And I want to make sure that that's where we go to, basically.
I think that's where we're trying to get to right now. You know, we're trying to get to that specific understanding. And
Because otherwise the property does get stigmatized,
Exactly.
or if it's not quite stigmatized, I'm now going to pay for an entirely parcel-wide sample soil testing, and I don't even want to think what that's going to cost me if I've had one simple spill and had it remediated, right?
Representative, to your question about the certainty and the closure, yeah, that of course that is our concern. I'll be honest, we've engaged the realtors and the CBA outside counsel who are environmental transaction attorneys. They represent banks in the financing of these properties. And, you know, we had them do a presentation for our folks, and we asked that very question, you know, certainty, closure, and, you know, how are you going to react when these regulations go into place? And again, I'll be honest that, you know, it was difficult, I think, for the bankers to answer. It's difficult to look at this whole regime, proposed regime, and get your arms around it and figure out what you're going to do in the future. So we have some concerns about that. I will say we did receive comments from the bankers on the order of, well, can it be any worse than the Transfer Act? You know, we think it'll capture more properties, but the hope is that it will, you know, properties will move through and be resolved.
Well, and I'm comfortable that DEEP knows how to take care of toxins. So if the standards change, and it's not that I have to ask DEEP to change their process, but maybe they have to be more aggressive through the process to issue the permit to get the banks to accept it. You know, someone's going to drive the financial. I'm going to leave DEEP to drive the conversation of how I'm not poisoned and how I take care of toxins. But I am going to leave the banks to drive me to how do I get clarity. And so we may have to be even more aggressive in some cases to make sure that we get whatever closure means. It's not just closure for toxicity, but it's closure to get to good financing and ease of transfer. So I don't want us to gum up the transfer on either side and make sure we get to a good place when we go to remedy. So that was my biggest concern.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Meskers. Questions? Yeah, so Art, you know, to your comment, it's going to capture more properties. That's going to take a whole lot of people totally off guard, who are totally unacquainted, who, you know, don't have experience with this or understanding of it. And that's a big concern.
Yeah, and on the residential side, I think, you know, there's the potential, at least for that. I don't know how homeowners are going to react to this new system. I suspect many of them won't be aware, but realtors will be aware, the banks will be aware. Again, hard to say how they react, but the things I think that we have focused on, the points in our memo that we're talking specifically with DEEP about, I think will address some, you know, many of these uncertainty concerns, if you will, that we have with regard to homeowners and how they might perceive and react to a spill. So, you know, the general exemption for residential single family owner occupied is great. We are still talking to them about the, you know, expansion to a multifamily. I think there's room for conversation there. Yeah, you know, I think of a situation like a duplex where you have, you know, two sides or, you know, what have you, you know, occupied by, you know, members of the same family. You know, that's you know, but on the other hand, we get their point where, a large, residential, building where you have a landlord who doesn't live there, making not one, Deep's position is that, those folks shouldn't be making decisions for other people. We hear that, understand that concern. So again, we will continue the conversation about that as well. But I think to your point, Senator, I think in the residential space, that's the concern.
Yeah, totally. I mean, and there's a whole series of, permutations. There's the owner occupied, to your point, there's the, family member occupied. And as I said, in my own community, I mean, I have a very large population of triple deckers, and, where we still have family members living in them. That's one thing. And then we've got this whole community of retirees who have invested in these properties as small businesses, and they're good landlords. And these are, good housing, which we're dealing with a housing shortage. These are, good rental properties. They're kept up. It's like almost a community. They're not family members, but they might as well be, because they've lived there forever, and, they take ownership, quite frankly, in the property. And so to have them swept into this whole new category of uncertainty.
Senator, I know the Realtor organization echoes your concerns, and that's one of the conversations that we are having with the agencies.
Yeah, and so then my question is, given the time frame that we are working under, what's the likelihood of moving forward to resolution on this? We heard the department say that this was too much of a big issue to take out of the regulations. So, this continues to be a pressing problem.
Again, I think as Art has said, he and I are not environmental lawyers, we're civics lawyers. So our next meeting will be with Deep and our environmental lawyers to try to figure out if there's some common area we can move forward with on this.
Okay, and so once again, I've asked for some response by March 11th. So I'll wait to hear from you all on this. Yes, Senator Martin.
So if there is a residential component to these regulations, I know that we have our disclosures for when we sell a residential home, up to 4 units, I believe. When we go finance for a commercial piece, it's a given that we need to do a phase 1. My question is, maybe it goes to Art, and you can say something, Jim, afterwards, but is it foreseeable that we could be asking for phase 1s with residential properties going forward?
I'm not certain, Senator. I think it depends a little bit on what happens prior to financing with inspections of property and disclosures. But this is the release-based, the premise of the release-based regulation is dependent on, I think, whether a property comes in depends on the spill and how the customer reacts to it, or rather the homeowner reacts to it. I just don't know. It's like sort of a crystal ball kind of question, how homeowners are going to react. One of the things that Deep has been very good about is agreeing to the current protection for lenders from liability if they were, for instance, to foreclose on a property and become the maintainer, if you will, of the property. And that will be in the next iteration of the regulation. So I think the concerns of lenders, I think is certainly I think going to be addressed. The other concern, of course, is if there is a spill on a property and it comes into the release-based regulations, what financial impact will that have on the homeowner, and therefore their ability to pay their mortgage, their ability to sell the house if they needed to, things of that nature. And then if they did, sort of foreclose, the value of the property, if you will, if that were addressed. I'm kind of looking for a way to answer your question. I'm not sure that I have, but I think it's difficult to say how the market is going to react. But my hope is that through addressing some of the points that we have been discussing with Deep, that uncertainty will be satisfactorily addressed.
Okay, sounds like the banks are concerned about the mortgage that will be impacted on a spill on a piece of property that they have a lien on. And I get Deep's requirement to be with something, regarding their involvement on that site and having regulations to clean that site. My concern is what we decide here with these regulations is knowing the past that commercial lending was not always a phase one was required on property. However, it has grown into its standard now. With these regulations that are before us right now, and we have a residential component, I can see easily that the banking community is going to be asking for a phase one on any piece of property. I could see that.
Well, and that's possible. My understanding of the Transfer Act right now is that it's it would be rare for a property to have to go into the Transfer Act, because I believe and I asked Graham to come up, or Emma and Brendan to come up and correct me if I get anything wrong here. So my understanding is that a residential property would have to have been an establishment as defined under the act, meaning there had to have been some business there or use of the property that a dry cleaner or whatever it might be. And I think that's fairly rare. And so I think, the house I live in, I know the history of it, the property, its use, and there was never an establishment there. So now we're getting away from that, and we're moving to this release space where every property could potentially come in. And so that change will be noted by the market, bankers and realtors and whoever it might be. And it's just really difficult for us to say at this point how they will react to that. It's an expensive thing to do, these environmental tests. So that is something I hope banks don't go there. But I can't predict what they'll do.
Jim, what does your crystal ball say?
From what I understand, is what Deep was explaining to us, that it is a very rare process for a residential for this to happen. And Graham has used the the story where no one's going to come and drill 12 holes in your house, in your property to check this out. But again, it is something that we're concerned with, and that's why we have our discussions with them related to residential.
I hope during the part of those conversations, what my concern with my question is a conversation that you all have with each other as well. Thank you. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Martin. Other questions? So anyway, Jim and Corey, we've got the white paper that was put out with, I don't know if it's 6 areas that are still of concern to your respective organizations. And so I'm asking to hear back from you, these committees on where you are and what has been perhaps resolved or strategized on by the 11th of March.
Absolutely.
We will do that.
Okay, thank you very much. And so if there are no other, we have, I think, one more person who is remote, and is that Emily Scott? Oh, yeah, you're here. Hey, how are you? You have the floor, Ms. Scott.
There we go. Thank you, members of the Environment Committee and the Commerce Committee. My name is Emily Scott, and I am a partner with Robinson & Cole, resident in the Hartford office. So I am one of the environmental transactional attorneys that has been a member of the working group for these many years. I'm also the present chair of the Connecticut Bar Association Environmental Section, though I should stress at the outset that I'm speaking only as an individual and not for my firm, its clients, or any organization of which I'm a member. I would like to offer my strong support of House Bill 7085. And that support is based on the literally hundreds of hours that I have spent on the working group with my trusted colleagues in EPOC, with the fine folks here from DEEP. And the version of the regulatory text that is before Regs Review now is, in my view, much improved by the 2 rounds of comments by the working group, stakeholder groups, and members of the public. There are other documents that have been referenced today, the forms for the application forms to be a PEP, the guidance documents with, scenarios that guide the regulated community on how they should interpret these regs. Those ancillary documents have not yet been crafted. In previous years, before the draft regulatory text was available and the now substantial final regulatory text was available, the working group had discussed convening subcommittees and having focused conversations on those ancillary documents, on the forms and guidance. It was not yet ripe for discussion then because the regulatory text wasn't available. So it was hard to craft the big finish line parade, right? If we didn't know what the race course would look like, but now we do. And so I am offering my strong support for House Bill 7085 because as the realtors and bankers were just so ably illustrating, some of the unintended consequences that we no doubt will face once we take this thing for a spin aren't known or knowable now. But once we do take it for a spin, I think some of those issues will quickly become apparent. And so it is critical that we have this framework to check in and make corrections immediately when the need for those corrections arises. My strong support for House Bill 7085 is tempered by one suggested tweak, which is, as this has come up in other testimony, but I'd like to punctuate it because I think it's important. As presently written, the statute calls for the working group to meet monthly until the regulations are adopted. So they're before Regs Review now. They could be adopted as early as the end of March. Let's just say realistically, we're looking at July. So if the regs are adopted in July, then Bill 7085 would have the working group meet again once the regulations are effective in March. So that's a blackout period of approximately, we don't yet know how long, but let's say for argument, 6 to 9 months, when the working group will be dormant, when we could be focused on the forms and guidance that will help streamline the implementation of the program and will help address some of the concerns that are being raised in white papers and testimony. So even if House Bill 7085 is passed, and I hope that it is, it will build in a blackout period because of the end date that's presently defined by statute for the working group. So as I, indicated in my written testimony with some citations, I would urge the amendment of House Bill 7085 to keep the working group active until the regs are effective. So a similar change to the change being made in Senate Bill 1351 and 1401, which I both support, where the critical juncture is not the adoption of the regs, but the effective date of the regs. I think that needs to be the critical juncture for, monthly meetings of the working group through the effective date of the regs, and then the quarterly check-in process contemplated by 7085 then kicks in once the regs are effective, so there's not this blackout period.
Thank you very much, Emily. Thanks for appearing before us. You did give us written testimony?
Correct.
Where you identified, you gave us language specific?
Correct.
Okay, that's important. Questions, Representative Meskers?
Yeah, Emily, I'm trying to understand. I think the trigger now is the submission of regs. Deep is thinking that it may, or the approval of regs, thinks it may be delayed through this period anyway. The working group, I believe, was last year's bill, right? In terms of the working group we established.
Public Act
Goes back.
20-9 established the working group.
So I don't know if in the interim, there's an amendment process that works for that before it comes to the assembly, which is what this bill does now. And so the bill creating the working group, we may need to amend for the effectiveness, but I mean, we're not going to be doing anything until it passes both chambers and signed by the governor. So we're going to be relying on goodwill in the interim, assuming regulations get done, I think.
Fair enough. That even if House Bill 7085 is tweaked to encompass the change I'm suggesting, where the working group would be active until the effective date, there may be a blackout period where we're kind of there may be, well, I won't say blackout period, a gray period where it's not statutorily mandated. But if it is clear that the working group activity will pick up again at the end of the session, I would hope that it continues uninterrupted.
Yeah, I don't think we've had any objections in terms of, I haven't seen anybody objecting to that on the committees, but I think that's reasonable. We're talking about the two arguments, or the two discussions are about the regulations and about the statutes. And the last piece that I look at is very banal, which is, does this dog hunt? So everything function. So the cooperation and coordination as to how we issue the permits and get everything flowing through the system, I think we're all in agreement that we want to make sure there's an iterative back and forth, because the public needs to be able to go, well, it's like the new relatively good and newer DMV experience. Once you've built it, you want to make sure that it's working correctly. Right. And so I think we've heard some very good comments from the LEPs. So, I think I'm predisposed to tell you. I don't think any of us are against it, but thank you.
Thank you, Representative Meskers. Questions and comments? Emily, thanks a lot.
Thank you
for all of your work here. Hang in there with us.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you.
Appreciate the opportunity.
Appreciate it. And I do not see anyone else signed up. Madam Clerk, is there someone I'm missing?
Nobody logged back in, and we've gone through the speaker order.
Thank you very much. And so without further ado, I would release you all. Most importantly, Graham, as we conclude this public hearing, thank you so much all.